busy billionaire hired a new nanny without bothering to check her background. When his son noticed they shared a rare genetic trait, a DNA test confirmed the unthinkable. She was his daughter from a relationship he'd forgotten about in college. His negligence as an employer led him to the daughter he never knew he had. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Julian Thorne, a man whose life was measured in billions and board meetings, stared at his son, Leo. The boy, all of 6 years old, was captivated by their new nanny, Anya. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Julian's penthouse, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden rays. The apartment, a monument to his success, felt strangely empty. A gnawing loneliness, a guilt as heavy as a concrete slab, pressed down on him. He hadn't truly seen Leo in months. Anya, with her easy smile and the way she coaxed laughter from Leo, was a stark contrast to the sterile efficiency of his life. He watched them, a silent observer, as Anya helped Leo build a precarious tower of blocks, her touch gentle, her voice a soft melody. A pang of something akin to envy twisted in Julian's chest. He hadn't felt this ease, this connection, in years. "Daddy?" Leo piped up, his eyes sparkling with mischief. "Anya has a mark just like mine." He pointed to a small, crescent-shaped birthmark on his wrist, then to a similar one on Anya's arm, hidden beneath her sleeve. Julian felt a prickle of unease. He hadn't noticed it before. "It's just a coincidence, Leo," he mumbled, his voice tight. He felt the familiar pull of his work, the need to escape the uncomfortable stirrings in his heart. He excused himself, retreating to his study, the mahogany desk a familiar refuge. But the image of the matching birthmarks and the warmth in Anya's smile haunted him. The silence in his opulent study felt deafening, amplifying his growing unease. His phone buzzed relentlessly, a symphony of his high-powered life, but all he could hear was the faint echo of Leo's innocent words. The weight of his neglect, of his emotionally barren life, pressed down on him with the force of a collapsing skyscraper. The following days were a blur of carefully orchestrated avoidance. Julian found himself increasingly drawn to the sterile calm of his office, the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of his keyboard a soothing counterpoint to the unsettling questions Leo's innocent observation had raised. He smelled the sharp scent of expensive leather from his desk chair, a familiar comfort in this unfamiliar territory of burgeoning parental responsibility. The weight of his neglect pressed down on him, heavier than any business deal gone sour. Leo, however, was relentless. "Daddy," he'd say, his small hand tugging at Julian's sleeve. "Anya and I are the same. We have the same moon mark." Each time, Julian would offer a distracted, "Yes, dear." His gaze fixed somewhere beyond his son's earnest face. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken anxieties, a silent chasm between a father and son who were growing further apart despite their shared DNA. One evening, Anya found Julian in the study, surrounded by paperwork that spilled onto the polished mahogany desk. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and expensive cigars. She cleared her throat, hesitant. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice soft yet firm. The gentle light from a nearby lamp illuminated the worry lines etched on her face, a stark contrast to her usual serene demeanor. The scent of lavender from her perfume, subtle yet persistent, cut through the stuffy atmosphere of the room. Julian looked up, his eyes dark and shadowed. "Yes, Anya?" he replied, his voice tight. He saw the worry in her eyes, mirrored in the tremor of her hands as she adjusted the strap of her bag. The silence stretched, filled only by the low hum of the air conditioning and Julian's own rising unease. He knew she sensed his unease, his avoidance. He knew that the quiet conversation they desperately needed was being avoided like a ticking time bomb. "Leo mentioned the birthmarks again today," Anya said, her voice barely a whisper. The words hung in the air, pregnant with unspoken implications. "It's unsettling to him that you seem uncomfortable with it." She met his gaze directly, her eyes unwavering. The soft lavender scent seemed to intensify, a poignant perfume of unspoken anxieties. The faint sound of Leo calling for his father from another room hung in the air, adding an extra layer of tension. Julian could feel the weight of his unspoken guilt threatening to crush him. He knew that this seemingly innocent conversation was leading them towards a precipice none of them were prepared for. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Julian's opulent study, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The scent of freshly brewed coffee, a rare indulgence, barely cut through the lingering aroma of old cigars. Julian sat hunched over his desk, the crisp pages of a financial report a stark contrast to the turmoil raging inside him. Leo's insistent questions about the shared birthmark echoed in his mind, a relentless soundtrack to his growing dread. He felt a tap on his shoulder. Anya stood in the doorway, the morning light catching the auburn highlights in her hair. She held a steaming mug, the faint scent of chamomile a calming counterpoint to his internal chaos. "Coffee, Mr. Thorne?" she offered softly, her voice a gentle melody. He took the mug, the warmth spreading through his cold fingers. He hadn't realized how tense he was until the warmth eased the knots in his shoulders. "Thank you, Anya," he murmured, his voice raspy. He looked up, meeting her gaze. Her eyes, the same hazel shade as Leo's, held a quiet concern that mirrored his own unease. The unspoken question hung heavy between them. How much longer could they avoid the truth? "Leo's been unusually quiet this morning," Anya said, her voice barely above a whisper, breaking the fragile silence. "He's probably just tired," Julian mumbled, avoiding her eyes. The lie felt brittle, easily shattered. He knew Leo's silence wasn't tiredness. It was the unspoken anxiety mirroring his own. Anya took a step closer, her presence filling the vast space of the study. "He keeps looking at both of us, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice low and steady, a stark contrast to the tremor in her hands. "He's noticing the avoidance, the discomfort." The silence stretched, filled only with the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall. Each tick a hammer blow against Julian's carefully constructed wall of denial. The weight of his actions, his past negligence, his present avoidance, pressed down on him, suffocating. He looked at Anya, truly looked at her, and saw not just a nanny, but a woman carrying a burden he'd unknowingly imposed. He saw a reflection of himself in her quiet strength, her unspoken pain, the shared hazel eyes, the same elusive curve of the mouth. The resemblance was undeniable, striking, terrifying. The truth, like a relentless tide, was beginning to pull him under. The weight of Anya's words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Julian felt a cold sweat prickling his skin, the warmth of the chamomile tea doing little to dispel the chill that had settled deep in his bones. He watched Anya, the subtle tremor in her hands a mirror of his own internal turmoil. The opulent study, usually a sanctuary of power and control, felt claustrophobic, the expensive Persian rug a cold expanse beneath his feet. He cleared his throat, the sound raspy and unconvincing. I understand your concern," he stammered, his voice betraying the tremor in his hands. He glanced at the financial report, the crisp numbers blurring before his eyes. Work, his usual refuge, offered no solace now. Only the gnawing unease of the unspoken truth remained. Anya stepped closer, her auburn hair catching the light like a flickering flame. The scent of her perfume, a subtle blend of vanilla and something subtly floral, was strangely comforting, a stark contrast to the metallic tang of fear in his own mouth. "Leo deserves answers, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice soft but firm. "And so do I." Her gaze was unwavering, steady and clear, penetrating the carefully constructed walls of his denial. He saw a flicker of something else in her eyes, a quiet sadness, a hint of resignation that chilled him more than his own fear. He saw a young woman who had carried a secret, a burden, for far too long, a burden he was directly responsible for. He swallowed hard, the lump in his throat making it difficult to speak. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed, each toll a stark reminder of the passing time, the time he'd wasted, the life he'd ignored. He looked at Anya, really looked at her, not as a nanny, but as a woman who bore an uncanny resemblance to his son. The shared hazel eyes, the same delicate curve of the lips, the same stubborn set to their jaw. It was undeniable, a brutal revelation etched in their shared features. He began, the word catching in his throat, the weight of his unspoken confession threatening to overwhelm him. He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair, the action mirroring his chaotic thoughts. The silence stretched, heavy and pregnant with unspoken accusations and unacknowledged guilt. The opulent study, a symbol of his success, felt like a gilded cage, trapping him in the consequences of his own actions. The truth, he knew, was inescapable. The avoidance was over. Anya's competence was undeniable. The sprawling Thorn Mansion, previously a chaotic whirlwind of half-eaten snacks and forgotten toys, blossomed under her gentle hand. Leo, usually a whirlwind of restless energy, was calmer, his laughter echoing through the once silent halls. The scent of freshly baked cookies often drifted from the kitchen, a comforting aroma that even Julian, buried in his work, couldn't entirely ignore. Yet Julian remained distant. He'd barely registered Anya's presence beyond acknowledging her efficient task completion. He saw her as an employee, a necessary cog in the well-oiled machine of his life. One evening, while Leo excitedly showed him a drawing, a vibrant depiction of himself and Anya sharing a laugh, Julian noticed it. A small, crescent-shaped birthmark, nestled just below Leo's left ear. He remembered a similar mark, a fleeting image from a hazy, long-ago memory, a memory he couldn't quite grasp. "Look, Daddy," Leo pointed. "Anya has one too." Julian's heart skipped a beat. He glanced at Anya, who was quietly tidying up Leo's art supplies. The same birthmark, almost identical, peeked from beneath her hair. It was absurd, a mere coincidence. He dismissed it with a distracted, "Yes, Leo, that's nice." But the seed of doubt, small and fragile at first, had been planted. The unnerving similarity gnawed at the edges of his mind, a persistent discord in the otherwise perfectly orchestrated symphony of his life. Later that night, Julian found himself staring at a childhood photo. A younger him, carefree and laughing, stood beside a woman with fiery auburn hair, a woman with a faint hint of a crescent-shaped birthmark visible near her ear. The image was blurry, the details hazy, but the unsettling familiarity was undeniable. A cold dread crept into his heart, a feeling as foreign and unwelcome as the nagging doubt that plagued his thoughts. His guilt over neglecting Leo intensified, twisting into a knot of fear and apprehension he couldn't unravel. The image of Anya's face, her quiet strength and gentle smile, flickered before his eyes, blurring the line between employee and something more. The warmth of his son's laughter was muted by the sudden, chilling possibility. He felt a profound unease, a premonition of an unthinkable truth that threatened to shatter the already fragile foundations of his meticulously constructed world. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Leo's room, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden rays. Leo, clutching his drawing, looked up at Julian. "Daddy," he said, his voice small, Can we get Anya a DNA test too?" Julian felt a cold dread grip his heart. The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. He avoided Leo's gaze, the weight of his potential paternity pressing down. "Leo," he began, his voice rough, That's not necessary." Anya entered, her presence a calming balm in the tense atmosphere. The scent of her lavender perfume, usually a comfort, now felt suffocating to Julian. He saw the slight tremor in her hand as she reached for Leo's drawing. The shared birthmark, now a constant silent accusation, was more prominent than ever. "He wants to know if we're related," Leo blurted out. The words, innocent yet devastating, hung between them, a tangible barrier. Anya's eyes, usually so bright, were clouded with a mixture of apprehension and something else, hope. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, before Anya gently spoke. "It's a fascinating idea, Leo, but we're just friends." Her voice was steady, but Julian detected a tremble beneath the surface. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that the truth lay far beyond just friends. The possibility hung over them like a storm cloud, threatening to unleash a torrent of long-buried secrets. The weight of Leo's question hung heavy in the air, a tangible thing pressing down on Julian. He felt the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in his chest, the taste of bitter dread coating his tongue. The opulent nursery, usually a haven of comforting toys and soft lighting, felt suffocating. Sunlight, once a cheerful presence, now seemed to highlight the stark reality of their situation. Anya's hand, trembling slightly, brushed a stray curl from Leo's forehead. The gesture, so gentle, so maternal, felt like a physical blow to Julian. He saw the flicker of something, a fragile hope, perhaps, or a desperate plea in her eyes. The shared birthmark, a crimson stain on their otherwise flawless skin, seemed to pulse with a silent accusation. "It's a good question, Leo," Anya said, her voice soft but firm, a carefully constructed dam against the torrent of emotions swirling beneath the surface. "But sometimes," she continued, glancing at Julian, her eyes holding a depth of unspoken understanding, "we need to accept things as they are, at least for now." The subtle shift in her tone, the careful wording, did nothing to alleviate Julian's growing unease. He saw the calculated control in her demeanor, the deliberate avoidance of direct answers. He knew instinctively that she was hiding something, protecting herself, perhaps protecting him. From what, he wasn't entirely sure. He opened his mouth to speak, to deflect, to deny, but no words came. The silence stretched, taut and unbearable, punctuated only by Leo's quiet breathing. The scent of lavender from Anya's perfume, usually a soothing presence, now felt cloyingly sweet, a heavy perfume masking something darker, something he instinctively feared. He felt the weight of his own past, the hazy memories of youthful indiscretions, rise to the surface, pressing against his consciousness like a suffocating blanket. The truth, he knew, was lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to shatter the fragile peace of this opulent nursery. He needed to know for Leo's sake and for his own. But the fear, the overwhelming terror of the potential revelation, paralyzed him. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating as the lavender scent of Anya's perfume. Julian felt the cool marble of the nursery floor against his bare feet, a stark contrast to the warmth radiating from Leo, nestled between Anya and himself. Leo, oblivious to the tension, traced the outline of the birthmark on his own arm, a mirror image of the one on Anya's wrist. "It's like magic," Leo whispered, his innocent words a painful counterpoint to the turmoil churning within Julian. Anya's smile was tight, a carefully constructed mask. "It is rather special, isn't it, Leo?" Her voice held a tremor he'd not noticed before, a vulnerability that chipped away at his carefully built walls of denial. Julian watched them, a gnawing unease growing within him. He saw the unspoken connection, the subtle mirroring of gestures, the shared glances that spoke volumes. The opulent nursery, usually a sanctuary, felt like a pressure cooker, the gilded cage of his own making. He cleared his throat, the sound brittle and strained. "Perhaps," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "perhaps it's just coincidence." The words felt hollow even to his own ears. The carefully constructed facade of the billionaire, the man who controlled empires, crumbled under the weight of his own uncertainty. Anya's gaze met his, unwavering. The warmth he'd initially found so captivating now seemed laced with something else, a cautious hope, tinged with a deep-seated sadness. He saw a reflection of his own guilt, his own buried past, staring back at him from her eyes. The afternoon sun, casting long shadows across the room, seemed to intensify the tension. The weight of unanswered questions, of potential truths, pressed down on him, suffocating him. He had to know. For Leo, for Anya, for himself. The DNA test, once a distant thought, now felt like an unavoidable, looming precipice. He needed to face the truth, however terrifying it might be. He needed to finally confront the ghost of his past. The ornate clock on the mantelpiece chimed 4 times, each toll a hammer blow against Julian's already frayed nerves. Leo, perched on Anya's lap, was engrossed in a picture book, oblivious to the simmering tension. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden rays. The air hung heavy, thick with unspoken questions. Anya's perfume, previously comforting, now felt cloying, a suffocating reminder of the delicate balance teetering on the edge of chaos. "Daddy?" Leo's small voice cut through the silence. "Why does Anya have the same mark as me?" His innocent question felt like an accusation. Julian swallowed, the lump in his throat constricting his breath. He looked at Anya, her gaze steady, her expression unreadable. He saw a flicker of something, apprehension, maybe? Or was it hope? A fragile, trembling thing clinging to life? He knelt, the cool marble floor a chilling contrast to the warmth radiating from Leo. "It's just a coincidence, sweetheart," he mumbled, his voice betraying his own lack of conviction. The words felt like lies, bitter and hollow on his tongue. Leo frowned, his small brow furrowed in confusion. "But it's the same shape, the same place, exactly the same." His persistence gnawed at Julian's carefully constructed composure. Anya's hand rested gently on Leo's back, her touch conveying a silent reassurance. "Sometimes," she said softly, her voice calm but laced with a subtle undercurrent of tension, "people share similar markings. It's quite common." The lie felt heavy, even to her own ears. The shared birthmark, a stark, undeniable link, hung between them, a tangible symbol of the unspoken truth. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the soft rustle of Leo's book pages. Julian felt a wave of nausea, a rising tide of dread threatening to engulf him. He couldn't keep avoiding the truth any longer. The weight of his past mistakes pressed down on him, crushing him under the weight of his own denial. He needed to know, for Leo, for Anya, and more than anything for himself. The DNA test was no longer an option. It was a necessity, a desperate plea for clarity in the swirling storm of his life. The antiseptic smell of the clinic was a stark contrast to the opulent scent of Julian's home. He sat stiffly, the leather of the waiting room chair cold against his skin. Leo, surprisingly quiet, clutched a small, worn toy car. Anya sat beside them, her usual calm demeanor replaced with a quiet tension that vibrated in the air between them. The rhythmic ticking of a wall clock amplified the silence, each tick a hammer blow against Julian's already shattered composure. He stole glances at Anya, her face pale but resolute. The birthmark, a faint, swirling nebula of dark pigment on her left shoulder, mirrored Leo's perfectly. It was a chilling reminder of the truth he desperately tried to ignore. The shared mark wasn't just a coincidence. It was a brand, a visible testament to a past he'd buried deep within the recesses of his mind. "Daddy?" Leo whispered, his voice barely audible above the clock's relentless tick. "Will we know soon?" His small hand reached out, seeking Julian's. The simple gesture pierced Julian's carefully constructed walls of denial. He squeezed Leo's hand tightly, the child's small fingers surprisingly strong. A nurse called his name, her voice a sharp crack in the suffocating stillness. Julian rose, his legs feeling unsteady beneath him. He felt Anya's gaze on him, a silent communion of shared anxiety. He offered her a weak smile, a desperate attempt to reassure her, himself and perhaps Leo. Stepping into the examination room, he felt a sudden wave of nausea, the weight of his unspoken fears threatening to overwhelm him. The truth, he knew, was waiting just around the corner, a truth that would irrevocably alter the course of his life. The next few moments, he knew, would determine everything. The silence was broken only by the rhythmic thump of his own racing heart. The doctor's voice, though soft, carried the weight of a verdict. "The results are conclusive. There's a 99.99% probability of paternity." The sterile scent of the room intensified, clinging to Julian's throat like a suffocating fog. He stared at the paperwork, the stark black ink blurring through a sudden rush of dizziness. Leo, oblivious to the gravity of the situation, tugged at his hand, his small fingers gripping tightly. "What does it mean, Daddy?" Anya's hand, cool and calm on Julian's arm, grounded him. Her touch, unexpectedly comforting, sparked a flicker of something akin to hope in the storm raging within him. He looked at her, seeing the same question mirrored in her wide eyes, a question of disbelief, of hurt, of a lifetime of unspoken longing. The shared birthmark, a swirling constellation of dark pigment on their shoulders, seemed to pulse faintly in the fluorescent light. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Julian felt a cold sweat prickling his skin, the leather of the chair suddenly abrasive against his thighs. He cleared his throat, the sound raspy and thin. It means Anya is your sister, Leo." The lie tasted like ash in his mouth, a desperate attempt to shield his son from the brutal truth, from the wreckage of his own past. Leo's brow furrowed. "But Anya's my nanny." His innocent confusion pierced Julian's carefully constructed facade. The weight of his deception, of his years of neglect, pressed down with crushing force. He felt Anya's gaze shift, a silent understanding passing between them, an acknowledgement of the lie, the shared burden of his denial. The journey home was a blur. The city lights smeared into streaks of color outside the limousine window, a chaotic reflection of Julian's inner turmoil. He glanced at Anya, her profile etched in the dim light, her quiet strength a stark contrast to his own inner turmoil. The silence was no longer suffocating, but thick with unspoken emotions, a simmering tension that threatened to erupt. He knew this was just the beginning. The truth, once unleashed, could not be easily contained, and the consequences, he was beginning to realize, would ripple far beyond his own life. The car ride was a silent testament to the unspoken. Leo, nestled between Anya and Julian, hummed a tuneless melody, oblivious to the seismic shift in their lives. The city lights blurred past, a kaleidoscope of colors mirroring the confusion swirling in Julian's mind. He stole glances at Anya. Her composure, a fragile mask barely concealing the turmoil within, was a stark contrast to his own inner chaos. He felt a deep, gnawing guilt, a heavy weight settling in his chest. "Daddy?" Leo's small voice broke the silence. "Why did the doctor say Anya is my sister?" The word hung in the air, heavy with implications. Julian's throat tightened. He reached out, his hand hovering over Leo's before retracting, paralyzed by the magnitude of his lie. He couldn't bear to look at Anya, the weight of his deception suffocating him. "It was a mistake, sweetheart," he mumbled, his voice hoarse. "A misunderstanding." Anya's hand rested lightly on Leo's other hand, her fingers brushing against Julian's. The contact sent a jolt through him, a fragile bridge across the chasm of his deceit. Her touch was a silent question, a challenge, a plea. He saw a flicker of sadness in her eyes, a hint of disappointment that echoed his own self-reproach. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the rhythmic hum of the limousine engine, a constant reminder of their uneasy journey. Reaching their penthouse, the opulent surroundings felt alien, starkly out of sync with the emotional turmoil that had consumed them. The usually comforting spaciousness felt cold and empty, a reflection of the emotional gulf between them. As Julian watched Anya lead Leo to his room, her gentle manner belying her inner strength, he knew the silence, the lies, the avoidance, couldn't continue. The truth, like a venomous seed, had taken root, and it was only a matter of time before it bloomed, irrevocably altering their lives. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating, leaving him facing the daunting task of repairing the damage he had inflicted. His heart ached with a guilt so profound it threatened to consume him whole. The penthouse felt cavernous, the usual comfort replaced by a chilling emptiness that mirrored Julian's soul. He watched Anya tuck Leo into bed, the soft glow of the nightlight casting long shadows on the walls. Her touch was gentle, almost hesitant, as if afraid to disturb the fragile peace. Leo, nestled amongst plush pillows, mumbled something unintelligible, his small hand clutching Anya's. "He's exhausted," Anya murmured, her voice barely a whisper as she turned to Julian. The unspoken hung heavy between them, a suffocating blanket woven from guilt and uncertainty. The opulent surroundings, the shimmering city lights visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the soft hum of the air conditioning, felt utterly alien, mocking the raw emotion that filled the room. Julian opened his mouth to speak, to offer some hollow reassurance, but the words caught in his throat. He wanted to reach out, to touch her, to somehow bridge the chasm that had opened between them, but fear held him back. The weight of his unspoken lie pressed down on him, crushing him beneath its burden. Anya's gaze met his, her eyes, usually sparkling with warmth, now clouded with a sadness that mirrored his own. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, leaving a glistening trail in its wake. The silence stretched, filled only with the soft rhythm of Leo's breathing and the distant city hum. It was a silence thick with unspoken accusations, a silence that screamed louder than any shouted argument. He saw a flicker of something else in her eyes, a fragile hope, perhaps? Or was it just a reflection of his own desperate need for forgiveness? The thought was a lifeline, a desperate grasp at redemption. He had to break the silence, to acknowledge the truth, no matter how devastating the consequences. But the words remained trapped, a prisoner in the cage of his fear and guilt. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that the silence couldn't last. The truth, like a relentless tide, would eventually crash over them, swallowing them whole. The future loomed, uncertain and terrifying, yet it was a future he had to face. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Anya, already awake, sat on the edge of Leo's bed, humming a soft melody as she braided his hair. The scent of freshly brewed coffee drifted from the kitchen, a stark contrast to the heavy silence of the previous night. Julian watched them from the doorway, a mixture of guilt and longing churning in his gut. The opulent penthouse, usually a symbol of his success, felt suffocating. He cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the quiet room. Anya looked up, her expression guarded. Leo, sensing the tension, snuggled closer to her. "Good morning," Julian said, his voice rough. Anya nodded, her gaze lingering on Leo's face before meeting Julian's. "Morning," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The unspoken question hung between them, thick and heavy as the morning fog settling over the city below. He took a step closer, the plush carpet muffling his footsteps. "About last night," he began, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. Anya met his gaze, her eyes a mixture of hurt and apprehension. "I understand," she said softly, her voice laced with a sadness that mirrored his own. "Things weren't easy." The understatement hung in the air, a fragile truce in the face of a looming storm. Julian reached out, his hand hovering just above her arm before retreating. The simple gesture spoke volumes, revealing the internal battle raging within him, his desire for connection against his paralyzing fear of the truth. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the hall. Leo, sensing the unspoken tension, tugged on Anya's hand. "Daddy, can we play?" he asked, his innocent question a jarring interruption to the weighty atmosphere. Anya smiled weakly at Leo, then at Julian, her eyes pleading. The unspoken request hung heavy, a plea for normalcy, for a brief respite from the emotional turmoil. Julian nodded, a hesitant acceptance forming in the depths of his heart. Perhaps, he thought, even the smallest step toward normalcy was a step in the right direction. The day unfolded slowly, filled with the mundane. Breakfast, playtime, a walk in the park, but even the ordinary felt charged with emotion. The weight of their shared secret hung heavy, yet underneath, a fragile hope began to bloom. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sprawling penthouse living room. Leo, perched on the plush, oversized sofa, meticulously arranged his toy cars, his brow furrowed in concentration. Anya watched him, a gentle smile playing on her lips, the faint scent of lavender clinging to her like a second skin. The air, thick with unspoken anxieties, crackled with a fragile tension. Julian, pacing restlessly by the window, his reflection a blurred silhouette against the cityscape, finally broke the silence. "The test. It's scheduled for tomorrow morning," he announced, his voice a low rumble, more to himself than to Anya. The words hung in the air, heavy and laden with dread. Anya glanced at him, her expression unreadable. She carefully placed a stray building block back into its container, the click a sharp sound in the quiet room. The city noise, the distant wail of a siren, the rumble of traffic, seemed muted, swallowed by the palpable tension. "I understand," Anya replied, her voice soft, almost inaudible. She rose and walked to the window, standing beside Julian. The cool glass beneath her hand offered a momentary solace, contrasting sharply with the warmth of the sun on her back. Julian looked at her profile, the delicate line of her jaw, the gentle curve of her neck, a rare birthmark, the same one Leo possessed, a small, dark smudge hidden beneath her hair. The resemblance was undeniable, a stark physical manifestation of the truth that hung between them, heavy and inescapable. He felt a surge of guilt, a wave of nausea threatening to overwhelm him. His actions, driven by negligence, had led to this moment, this fragile dance on the precipice of a life-altering revelation. He swallowed, his throat dry. I should have been more careful," he mumbled, the words barely a whisper lost in the vastness of the room. Anya turned, her eyes meeting his. They were filled not with anger, but with a weary sadness that mirrored his own. "Careful?" she repeated softly, the word a question hanging in the space between them. She didn't need to elaborate. The unspoken accusations were as potent as any shouted words. The silence returned, punctuated only by Leo's gentle hum as he continued to play, oblivious to the emotional storm brewing around him. The weight of their shared secret pressed down, a suffocating blanket stifling every hopeful breath. The opulent penthouse, usually a sanctuary, felt like a prison, its gilded cage trapping them in a suffocating web of guilt and uncertainty. The approaching DNA test felt not like a solution, but like an impending judgment. The following morning, the penthouse felt colder than usual, the city lights a stark contrast to the sterile environment of the medical testing facility. Julian fidgeted, the leather of his expensive car seat a poor substitute for the comfort he desperately craved. Leo, nestled in the back seat, hummed a cheerful tune, blissfully unaware of the looming revelation. Anya sat beside Julian, her usual composure subtly fractured. The silence was thick, heavy with unspoken anxieties. The scent of antiseptic, sharp and clinical, clung to the air, a jarring counterpoint to the lingering scent of lavender from Anya's comforting presence in their home. Julian watched Anya's profile, the way the sunlight caught the curve of her cheekbone, highlighting the delicate birthmark. The resemblance to Leo was undeniable, a constant, painful reminder of his past negligence. He felt a prickle of guilt, a cold dread settling in his stomach. At the lab, the sterile white walls amplified the silence. Leo, surprisingly calm, played with a small toy car, oblivious to the tension radiating from his father and Anya. The waiting room clock ticked with an irritating slowness, each second an eternity. Anya's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. Her eyes, usually warm and engaging, were clouded with a mixture of apprehension and a quiet, simmering anger. Finally, the doctor appeared, a solemn expression on his face. He handed Julian a sealed envelope. The simple act felt monumental, laden with years of unspoken history and a lifetime of potential consequences. Julian's hands trembled as he accepted it, his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird. He didn't dare to look at Anya, fearing the storm he knew was brewing within her. The weight of his past, of his forgotten life, threatened to crush him. He needed answers, but the truth held the potential to shatter his carefully constructed world. The envelope felt like a verdict, sealing his fate. The silence was broken only by the soft sounds of Leo's small car rumbling across the waiting room floor. The future hung in the balance, uncertain and terrifying. Julian tore open the envelope, his hands shaking so violently the paper fluttered like a trapped bird. The crisp white of the results glared back at him, stark and unforgiving under the fluorescent lights. He stared, breath catching in his throat, the words blurring before his eyes. Anya's quiet intake of breath was the only sound in the sterile room. Leo, still engrossed in his toy car, remained oblivious. "Well?" Anya's voice was barely a whisper, a fragile thing in the suffocating silence. Her eyes, usually so bright, were clouded with a fear that mirrored his own. Julian couldn't speak. He couldn't bring himself to utter the words that would shatter their lives. He swallowed, the lump in his throat a physical manifestation of his guilt. He looked at Leo, at the tiny birthmark nestled behind his ear, a mirror image of the one on Anya's cheek. The simple fact of it, the undeniable truth, brought a fresh wave of nausea. He finally managed a choked sound, a strangled whisper that was lost in the sterile hum of the air conditioning. He pushed the paper across the small table towards Anya, unable to meet her gaze. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Leo's quiet hum and the rhythmic ticking of the clock, each tick a hammer blow against Julian's already fractured composure. Anya's hand reached out, her fingers trembling as she picked up the paper. Her eyes scanned the words, her expression slowly shifting from apprehension to disbelief, then a slow burn of anger. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and vulnerable. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, leaving a glistening trail in its wake. The scent of antiseptic mingled with the faint, lingering sweetness of her perfume, a stark contrast to the bitter taste of revelation filling the air. The weight of 20 years of silence, of a life unlived, crashed down on them all. The sterile white walls of the clinic seemed to press in on them, amplifying the raw emotion that hung heavy in the air. The toy car tumbled from Leo's hand, a small sound in the face of the monumental shift in their lives. Anya's fingers tightened around the paper, the crisp edges digging into her palm. The sterile scent of the clinic, usually unnoticed, now felt suffocating, a stark contrast to the faint floral aroma clinging to her clothes. She looked up, her gaze meeting Julian's, and saw a raw, unfiltered grief etched onto his face, a stark contrast to the cool, controlled facade he usually presented. He looked older. Suddenly, his shoulders slumped, the weight of the revelation crushing him. I didn't know," he whispered, his voice hoarse, the words barely audible above the hum of the air conditioning. The confession hung in the air, thick and heavy with unspoken years. His eyes, usually sharp and focused, were now filled with a deep, agonizing sorrow. A wave of nausea washed over Anya. Disbelief warred with a nascent, painful understanding. Anger, a hot, burning ember, flickered within her. 20 years stolen, a life denied, a connection severed. But beneath the anger, a fragile tendril of longing sprouted, a desperate need for the father she'd never known. "And what now?" she asked, her voice trembling, the question hanging in the silence like a fragile kite in a storm. The words tasted like ash in her mouth. Leo, startled by the intensity of the moment, whimpered softly, clutching his toy car. Julian ran a hand through his hair, the gesture betraying the turmoil within. He looked at Leo, his gaze softening, a mixture of guilt and protectiveness clouding his eyes. The boy was oblivious, absorbed in his game, yet his presence was a stark reminder of the shattered pieces of Julian's life. The small birthmark behind his ear, a mirror image of Anya's, was a stark, painful symbol of their intertwined destinies. The weight of the revelation pressed down on them, a suffocating blanket of silence broken only by Leo's occasional whimper. The clock ticked relentlessly, each second stretching into an eternity. The small, sterile room felt vast, echoing with unspoken emotions, the truth hanging heavy and unresolved in the air. Leaving the clinic felt like stepping from a frozen wasteland into a blinding sun. The future, once clear, was now a swirling, uncertain vortex of possibilities and impossible choices. The car ride home was a silent testament to the upheaval. Leo, blissfully unaware, hummed a tuneless melody, his small hand gripping a worn stuffed animal. Julian stared blankly at the passing cityscape, the familiar streets blurring into an indistinguishable stream of light and shadow. The revelation hung between them, a palpable weight pressing down on the plush leather seats. The air conditioning hummed, a relentless, mechanical counterpoint to the turmoil churning within him. Anya, sitting beside him, felt a chilling detachment. The news had landed like a physical blow, leaving her breathless and numb. The anger she'd anticipated hadn't arrived. It was replaced by a hollow ache, a sense of profound loss that resonated with a lifetime of unspoken questions. She glanced at Julian, his profile etched with exhaustion and a grief so deep it seemed to physically drain him. I don't know what to say," Julian finally murmured, his voice rough with unshed tears. He rubbed his tired eyes, the gesture betraying the years of repressed emotion. Anya met his gaze, her own eyes mirroring his exhaustion. "Nor do I," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. The silence that followed was heavy, laden with the weight of unspoken words, unlived years. The city lights blurred through her tear-filled eyes, transforming into shimmering, indistinct shapes. The scent of the city, exhaust fumes, damp earth, and something vaguely floral, was lost in the whirlwind of emotions consuming her. Reaching out, she gently touched Leo's hand, the small gesture anchoring her to the present. His soft, warm skin brought a fragile comfort amidst the chaos. She saw Julian glance at her hand on Leo's, a flicker of something akin to understanding crossing his features. The car pulled into the driveway of his sprawling mansion, the imposing structure a stark contrast to the fragile vulnerability he felt inside. Stepping out into the cool night air, the sharp scent of petrichor, the smell of rain on dry earth, momentarily pierced the emotional fog. A single tear escaped her eye and traced a path down her cheek. The enormity of the situation hit her anew. A life irrevocably altered, a father she never knew she longed for, a son who was both a stranger and a constant in her suddenly skewed reality. This was not just about a DNA test. It was about a lifetime of what-ifs, and a future so uncertain it felt like walking a tightrope across an abyss. The sterile white of the envelope felt like a brand against Julian's skin. He tore it open, the paper crackling like a dying fire. The stark black print blurred through a sudden rush of dizziness. He read the results twice, 3 times, each repetition hammering the truth home with brutal force. Anya was his daughter. A wave of nausea washed over him. The opulent study, usually a sanctuary of power, felt suddenly claustrophobic. The scent of old leather and expensive cigars, usually comforting, now reeked of his own profound failure. He sank into his leather chair, the plush comfort offering no solace. Memories, fragmented and hazy, flickered through his mind. A hazy college night, a laughing girl with eyes like Anya's, a fleeting touch, a regret swiftly buried under the relentless pursuit of success. The amnesia, he realized with a shudder, wasn't a blank slate, but a carefully constructed wall protecting him from a truth too painful to face. Anya found him there, hours later. The room plunged into shadows except for the harsh glare of the desk lamp illuminating his ashen face. Leo, asleep on the sofa, stirred. She placed a gentle hand on Julian's shoulder. The touch was unexpected, and the silence that followed was thick with unspoken accusations and desperate pleas. It's true, isn't it?" Anya's voice was a fragile whisper, barely audible above the rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the hall. Julian nodded, unable to speak, the weight of 20 years of denial pressing down on him. The rich mahogany of his desk seemed to mock him, its polished surface reflecting the turmoil in his eyes. The scent of Anya's perfume, a delicate floral scent, drifted to him, a stark contrast to the bitter metallic taste of his own betrayal. I'm sorry," he finally managed, his voice raw with regret. The words felt inadequate, pathetic even against the magnitude of his actions. The unspoken question hung between them. What now? The future, once so clear, was now a swirling vortex of uncertainty. The weight of his responsibility pressed down on him, heavier than any business deal gone wrong. The comfortable silence of his mansion was shattered, replaced by the deafening silence of his guilt. The soft snores of his son from the sofa were a stark reminder of his past failures and the urgent need to rectify them. The weight of the revelation pressed down on Julian, a physical burden mirroring the emotional turmoil tearing through him. His opulent study, usually a haven of control, felt like a cage. The scent of expensive leather and polished wood, once comforting, now mocked his failure. He stared at the DNA results, the stark black print a stark contrast to the swirling chaos in his mind. He saw Anya's face, her calm facade a mask hiding the storm within. He pictured Leo, his son, sleeping innocently, unaware of the seismic shift in his life. Anya entered, her movements hesitant, a quiet grace belying the anxiety etched on her face. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, painting stripes of gold across the plush carpet, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the golden light, but Julian saw only darkness. He watched her approach, the delicate floral scent of her perfume a painful reminder of his absence. "It's true, then." Her voice, though soft, carried the weight of years of unspoken questions, of a life lived without the father she deserved. He could only nod, the simple gesture heavy with the weight of his 20 years of silence. The words wouldn't come. His throat was choked with regret, his mind a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. Guilt, shame, and a dawning, terrifying sense of responsibility. He felt the cold press of the mahogany desk against his back, its solidity a stark contrast to the fragility of his carefully constructed world, now crumbling around him. Leo stirred on the sofa, his small whimper cutting through the suffocating silence. Anya moved towards him, her touch gentle, her love for the boy palpable. Julian watched them, a pang of something akin to tenderness breaking through the wall of his self-reproach. This was his family, a family he'd almost destroyed through his own negligence. The revelation wasn't just about a forgotten past. It was about a future he had to fight for, a future he'd almost thrown away. The unspoken question hung heavy in the air. How could he begin to repair the damage? The ticking grandfather clock in the hall seemed to mock his silence, each tick a relentless reminder of the time lost, the time he couldn't get back. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the room, mirroring the lengthening shadows of his own past. He had to start somewhere, somehow. He had to try. The silence in the study hung thick, broken only by the rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock, each chime a hammer blow against Julian's crumbling composure. He sat rigidly, the DNA report a stark white rectangle against the dark mahogany desk. The scent of old paper and leather, usually comforting, now felt suffocating. Anya stood by the window, the late afternoon sun catching the gold highlights in her hair, a stark contrast to the shadows gathering in her eyes. Leo, oblivious to the gravity of the situation, slept soundly on the sofa, his soft breaths punctuating the heavy silence. I don't understand," Anya finally whispered, her voice barely audible above the clock's insistent rhythm. Her hands, usually so deft and gentle with Leo, were clenched into fists. The faint scent of lavender from her perfume seemed to hang in the air, a fragile bloom amidst the storm brewing in the room. Julian swallowed, his throat dry. The words wouldn't come. He looked at his daughter, a woman he'd never known, and a guilt so profound it threatened to consume him. There's no other explanation," he finally managed, his voice a rough rasp. He saw the flicker of hurt, of anger, in her eyes. It was a mirror reflection of the tempest raging within him. A wave of nausea washed over him. The memories, fragmented and hazy, began to surface. A college party, a fleeting encounter, a face blurred by time and alcohol. He'd forgotten, he'd truly forgotten. The weight of that realization pressed down on him, crushing him beneath the weight of his own negligence. Anya took a tentative step closer, her gaze unwavering. 20 years, she breathed, the words laced with a bitterness that mirrored his own self-reproach. 20 years you didn't know me. 20 years Leo has grown up without knowing he had a sister. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, catching the golden light. Julian watched her, a knot tightening in his chest. This wasn't just a business deal gone wrong. This was a lifetime of damage he had to repair. He had to start somewhere, somehow. He looked at Leo, his son, his innocent son, and the profound, gut-wrenching realization hit him. This wasn't just about Anya. It was about the family he'd almost destroyed. He had to make amends. He had to try. The question wasn't how. It was why hadn't he tried sooner? The grandfather clock ticked on, each tick a relentless reminder of the time lost and the arduous road ahead. The mahogany desk felt cold beneath Julian's hands. He stared at the DNA report, the stark black lettering blurring through a film of unshed tears. The scent of old leather and polished wood, usually a comfort, now felt suffocating, a cruel mockery of his meticulously ordered life, now irrevocably shattered. Anya stood by the French windows, her back to him, the late afternoon sun painting the curve of her neck in gold. He'd never noticed before how elegant she was, how her quiet strength belied a hidden vulnerability. It's hard to believe," Anya whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the city outside. She turned, her eyes, the same startling green as Leo's, filled with a mixture of disbelief and hurt. The lavender scent of her perfume, faint yet persistent, seemed to cling to the air, a fragile note amidst the gathering storm. "I know," Julian rasped, his voice thick with a guilt that felt like a physical weight in his chest. He wanted to reach out, to touch her, to somehow undo the damage of 20 years of neglect, but the words caught in his throat. Memories, fragmented and blurry, flickered through his mind. A hazy college party, a laughing girl with fiery hair, a stolen kiss beneath a starlit sky. He remembered nothing beyond that fleeting moment, a void where a daughter should have been. The shame was a bitter acid, burning its way through him. 20 years, Anya repeated, her voice low and trembling. 20 years you didn't know me. 20 years Leo grew up without knowing he had a sister. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, shimmering like a fallen star. Leo stirred on the sofa, his soft snores a jarring counterpoint to the intensity of their unspoken grief. The child, oblivious to the seismic shift in his life, slept peacefully, a tiny island of innocence in a sea of adult turmoil. Julian swallowed, the lump in his throat constricting his breathing. He looked at Anya, truly looked at her, and saw not just a nanny, but a woman, a daughter, a part of him he'd unknowingly lost. The realization was both agonizing and exhilarating, a terrible burden and a profound joy intertwined. His carefully constructed world, based on ambition and self-reliance, lay in ruins. Yet, amidst the devastation, a fragile seed of hope began to take root. He had to make amends. He had to start building a future he'd nearly destroyed. The silence in Julian's opulent study hung heavy, thick with unspoken accusations. The scent of expensive leather and polished mahogany did little to mask the raw emotion clinging to the air, a volatile mix of shock, disbelief, and the bitter tang of regret. He watched Anya, the sunlight catching the faint dusting of freckles across her nose, a feature Leo also possessed. The resemblance, once dismissed as coincidence, now screamed a truth he couldn't ignore. I don't understand," Julian finally managed, his voice a rough whisper that betrayed the turmoil within. His hands, usually so steady and assured, trembled as he unconsciously smoothed the creases of his tailored suit. The fabric, usually a source of comfort and control, felt constricting, mirroring the suffocating weight of his guilt. Anya's gaze was unwavering, her green eyes mirroring the storm raging inside her. "You hired me without a background check," she stated, her voice quiet but firm, each word carrying the weight of unspoken years. The faint scent of lavender from her perfume seemed to grow stronger, a poignant counterpoint to the heavy silence. He flinched. Her words were an indictment, a stark reminder of his careless negligence. I was overwhelmed," he offered, the explanation pathetically weak even to his own ears. He looked away, unable to meet her gaze, the image of a younger, reckless self flashing before his eyes. He saw a whirlwind romance, impulsive decisions, and the brutal clarity of a forgotten morning. Anya moved towards the French windows, her fingers tracing the intricate carvings of the ornate frame. The city sprawled below, a glittering tapestry of lights against the darkening sky. "Overwhelmed with work?" she repeated, her voice laced with a bitterness that cut him to the core. "Overwhelmed with your own life, so you overlooked mine, overlooked Leo's." The accusation hung in the air, a sharp, painful truth. He saw the hurt reflected not only in her eyes, but in the subtle slump of her shoulders, the barely perceptible tremor in her hand. He had not only abandoned Anya, but had also, through his negligence, robbed Leo of his sister. The realization was a fresh wave of crushing guilt. The mahogany desk, his symbol of success and control, felt suddenly cold and alien beneath his fingertips. The carefully constructed walls of his life were crumbling, leaving him exposed, vulnerable, and deeply ashamed. The weight of the revelation pressed down on Julian, a physical burden as heavy as the mahogany desk before him. He watched Anya, her back to him, silhouetted against the cityscape. The city lights, a million tiny sparks of defiance against the encroaching night, mirrored the turmoil in his own soul. He felt a pang of something akin to fear, a primal instinct to run, to hide from the consequences of his actions. But the sight of her slender frame, the delicate curve of her neck, stopped him. This wasn't some faceless employee. This was his daughter. He cleared his throat, the sound raspy and unfamiliar. "Anya," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, lost in the vastness of the room. I need to understand." Anya turned, her face pale in the soft glow of the setting sun. Her eyes, usually bright and welcoming, held a deep well of hurt. "Understand what, Julian?" she asked, her voice low and measured, each word carefully chosen. The scent of lavender, faint but persistent, hung in the air between them, a stark contrast to the heavy silence. He swallowed, the lump in his throat making it difficult to speak. The years of carefully constructed emotional walls crumbled, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. "Understand how this could have happened," he stammered, the words failing to capture the enormity of his guilt. He gestured helplessly, his hands trembling slightly. Anya moved closer, her steps slow and deliberate, like someone walking across fragile ice. "How I could have existed for 23 years without you knowing?" she asked, her voice barely a murmur. "Or how you hired me to care for your son, without even a cursory glance at my background." A tear traced a lonely path down her cheek, catching the light and glittering like a fallen star. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. The city lights seemed to dim, the vibrant tapestry of the skyline fading into a hazy blur. He saw the pain etched on her face, a mirror reflecting his own profound regret. He had not only abandoned her, but had carelessly jeopardized the delicate bond between her and Leo, his son. The weight of his past actions pressed down on him, a crushing burden of guilt and regret. His carefully constructed world, a world built on success and ambition, was crumbling under the weight of his long-forgotten past. The truth, raw and unforgiving, hung heavy in the air, a bitter reminder of his negligence. The scent of lavender mixed with the expensive leather of his desk, a strange and unsettling perfume of revelation and regret. The penthouse apartment felt vast and empty, despite the presence of Anya and Julian. Rain lashed against the panoramic windows, mirroring the storm raging inside Julian. The scent of lavender, still clinging to Anya's cashmere sweater, was a jarring contrast to the sharp, metallic tang of fear prickling Julian's skin. He hadn't slept, the revelation echoing in the silence of his opulent bedroom, a mocking counterpoint to the soft snores of his son emanating from the next room. I don't know what to say," Julian finally managed, his voice a strained whisper. He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair, the movement jerky and uncontrolled. The expensive mahogany desk, usually a symbol of his power, felt like a prison. Anya remained standing, her posture rigid, a stark contrast to the usual fluidity of her movements. The city lights blurred through her tears, transforming the familiar cityscape into a kaleidoscope of pain. "You don't have to say anything," she replied, her voice low and husky. "But you do have to understand the implications of your actions. Hiring me, caring for Leo without knowing." She trailed off, unable to articulate the depth of her hurt. The weight of unspoken words hung heavy in the air, thick and suffocating. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the relentless drumming of the rain. Julian watched her, his heart aching with a guilt so profound it threatened to consume him. He saw not just a woman he'd unwittingly hired, but a young woman who bore his features, carried his DNA, and had lived a life devoid of the father she deserved. He saw the years of absence reflected in her eyes, a lifetime of unanswered questions, of unfulfilled longings. The weight of his forgotten past, once a hazy, uncomfortable memory, now pressed down on him with crushing force. He had to fix this. He had to make amends. But how? The sudden sound of Leo's whimpers from the next room cut through the thick tension. Anya moved first, her maternal instincts overriding her own pain. "I should go to him," she said softly, her voice betraying a hint of the warmth Julian had only now begun to fully appreciate. She looked back at him, a question hanging unspoken in the air, a question about what came next, about how they would navigate this unimaginable situation. He could see it in her eyes, the hope flickering alongside the hurt, a tiny spark of optimism amidst the raging storm. And in that fragile hope, Julian found a sliver of his own. His journey to reconciliation had begun. The next morning, sunlight sliced through the gap in the curtains, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Anya woke first, the memory of the previous night's revelation heavy on her chest. The luxurious silk sheets felt cold against her skin, a stark contrast to the warmth of Leo's small hand nestled in hers as he slept. She carefully disentangled herself, the movement slow and deliberate, not wanting to disturb the peaceful slumber of the boy who was, inexplicably, now her half-brother. Julian was already awake, sitting at his desk, the morning light casting long shadows across his hunched form. The usually immaculate room was in disarray, papers scattered, coffee spilled, the air thick with the scent of stale coffee and regret. He looked up as Anya entered, his eyes bloodshot and weary. "Good morning," Anya said, her voice barely a whisper. The words felt inadequate, a flimsy bridge over a chasm of unspoken emotions. He didn't reply, his gaze fixed on the DNA test report lying on the desk, a stark white rectangle against the dark mahogany. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Anya moved towards the window, the panoramic view of the city offering little solace. Below, the relentless rhythm of city life carried on, oblivious to the emotional earthquake unfolding within the penthouse. She felt a deep ache in her chest, a mix of anger, betrayal, and a surprising longing for the man who was both her father and her former employer. The lavender scent of her sweater, a constant reminder of the previous night's encounter, seemed to intensify her pain. I need some time," Julian finally mumbled, his voice barely audible above the city's hum. He avoided her gaze, his fingers tracing the edge of the report. The gesture was almost pathetic in its fragility. Anya nodded, understanding dawning in her eyes. This wasn't about immediate answers, but about navigating the uncharted territory of their newfound relationship. It was about healing, about forgiveness, a process that would undoubtedly take time. "I understand," she said softly, "but Leo he needs both of us." The statement hung in the air, a simple truth that offered a fragile ray of hope amidst the storm. The weight of the unspoken hung heavy between them, a silent acknowledgement of the immense task that lay ahead, a task that required not just understanding, but empathy, patience, and ultimately, love. The penthouse, usually a sanctuary of polished marble and minimalist design, felt suffocating. Julian retreated further into his work, the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of his fingers on the keyboard a frantic counterpoint to the silence Anya held vigil in. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the golden shafts, a poignant metaphor for the scattered pieces of their lives. Anya found herself drawn to Leo's room, the child's soft breaths a lullaby against the turmoil raging in her heart. She sat beside his bed, her fingers tracing the delicate curve of his cheek, the familiar birthmark a stark reminder of the impossible truth. The soft cotton of his pajamas was cool against her fingertips. A wave of protectiveness washed over her, fierce and primal. Later, a tentative knock on the door broke the silence. Julian stood there, his shoulders slumped, the sharp lines of his jaw softened by exhaustion. The usual crispness of his suit was rumpled, his tie loosened. He looked older, wearier than his years. Can we talk?" he asked, his voice a low rasp. Anya nodded, leading him to the balcony. The city spread below them, a glittering tapestry of light and shadow, a world seemingly indifferent to their private chaos. The chill autumn air nipped at their skin. I don't understand how this happened," Julian began, his voice cracking. "It was a long time ago. I don't remember." His gaze was fixed on the distant cityscape, avoiding her eyes. "I know," Anya replied softly, "but the fact remains. We are connected. You are my father, and Leo is my brother." The words hung in the frigid air, stark and undeniable. The scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke was carried on the breeze, a strangely comforting fragrance amidst the turmoil. He turned then, his eyes filled with a mixture of remorse and confusion. "I've been a terrible father to both of you," he confessed, the words tumbling out in a rush. "A negligent employer, a negligent father." He ran a hand through his hair, his usually impeccable composure shattered. The city lights twinkled below, a vast indifferent ocean reflecting the turmoil in their hearts. Anya felt a surprising surge of empathy. He wasn't just a callous billionaire. He was a man grappling with a devastating truth, a truth he hadn't even known existed until a few short hours ago. The weight of that realization hung heavy in the air, a silent testament to the long, difficult road ahead. The following day brought a fragile truce. The penthouse, usually a whirlwind of activity, felt strangely still. Sunlight, muted by the autumnal haze, painted long shadows across the polished floors. Julian, his usual crisp attire replaced by rumpled clothes, moved with a hesitant grace, his sharp features softened by exhaustion. He avoided Anya, his eyes darting away whenever their paths crossed, a stark contrast to his usual commanding presence. Leo, sensing the tension, clung to Anya, his small hand gripping hers with surprising strength. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee, usually a welcome stimulant, hung heavy and unsettling in the air. Anya found herself drawn to the balcony. The city spread out below like a glittering map of anxieties. The wind whipped her hair across her face, carrying the faint scent of rain and damp earth, a stark contrast to the sterile luxury of the penthouse. She watched Julian enter, his shoulders slumped, his gait unsteady. He stopped several feet away, his gaze fixed on the distant cityscape. I need to talk to you," he began, his voice barely a whisper above the wind's howl. The usual steely control in his voice was absent, replaced by a vulnerability that both surprised and touched her. Anya turned, her expression a mixture of weariness and quiet strength. "About what, Julian?" she asked, her voice calm yet firm. The city lights reflected in her eyes, mirroring the complexities of her emotions. A mixture of anger, hurt, and a fragile hope flickered within. He hesitated, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. "About us, about Leo, about everything." His gaze finally met hers, revealing a deep well of remorse. The weight of his unspoken words hung heavy between them, a silent testament to the tangled web of their lives. A lone seagull cried overhead, its mournful cry echoing the turmoil in their hearts. The city's lights, usually a symbol of power and success, felt cold and distant, offering no solace to their troubled souls. He looked older, worn down by the weight of his revelation, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the wind's mournful song, before he finally continued in a strained whisper. I need to understand. The penthouse suite, usually a beacon of sterile luxury, felt suffocating. The scent of expensive cologne, usually comforting, now clung to the air like a cloying shroud. Julian avoided eye contact, his usual sharp gaze lost in the swirling patterns of his Persian rug. He paced, a restless caged animal, the silence punctuated only by the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of his polished shoes against the floor. Anya watched him, her arms wrapped around Leo, who was unusually quiet, his usual boisterous energy subdued. The weight of the unspoken hung heavy between them, a tangible presence in the room. "He needs his father," Anya finally said, her voice low, barely audible above the muffled thrum of the city outside. The words were directed at Leo, but her gaze remained locked on Julian. Her expression was a carefully constructed mask of calm, hiding the storm of emotions raging beneath the surface. Julian stopped pacing. He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture betraying the turmoil within. "I know," he muttered, his voice rough with unshed tears. The admission felt monumental, a crack in the carefully constructed wall he'd built around himself. Leo, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, looked up at Anya, his big brown eyes filled with a sadness that mirrored her own. He shifted closer, his small body pressing against hers, seeking comfort in her presence. He didn't understand the intricacies of the situation, but he understood the tension, the unspoken words hanging in the air thick and heavy like a suffocating fog. The afternoon sunlight, filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows, cast long shadows across the room, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the golden light beams. It was a stark contrast to the turmoil in their hearts, the unspoken accusations and the nascent hope clinging to the fragile possibility of a new beginning. The city outside buzzed with life, oblivious to the silent drama unfolding within the opulent walls of the penthouse. "This isn't just about a DNA test," Anya said, her voice gaining strength. "It's about a life that was stolen, a father who was absent." Her words were laced with both accusation and a desperate plea for understanding. Her gaze, unwavering, met his. She saw the guilt, the regret swirling in the depths of his eyes, a reflection of her own pain. Julian flinched, the accusation striking home with brutal accuracy. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. The weight of his past actions, of his years of negligence, crashed down on him, crushing him under the weight of his own making. He looked at his son, then back at Anya. The realization, sharp and painful, began to dawn. This wasn't just about a forgotten past. It was about his future, about rebuilding a life that had been shattered by his own actions. The silence stretched, pregnant with unspoken words, the unspoken regrets, the dawning realization of a life he had nearly lost. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating as the city lights blurred outside the penthouse window. Julian, his face etched with a weariness that went beyond simple fatigue, finally spoke, his voice a low rumble. I don't know what to say." He ran a hand over his face, the harsh lines of his jaw softened by exhaustion. Leo, nestled against Anya, whimpered softly, his small hand clutching her arm. Anya's gaze softened slightly, the anger that had flared earlier now tempered by a weary sadness. "You don't have to say anything now, Julian, but understand this, you owe us both an explanation. More than an explanation, you owe us your presence. Leo needs a father. And she swallowed, her voice catching in her throat. "I needed you a long time ago." The luxurious penthouse, usually a symbol of Julian's success, felt stark and cold, the expensive furnishings unable to mask the emotional chill permeating the room. The city sounds, usually a muted background hum, now seemed to press in, a relentless reminder of the world outside their fractured family unit. Julian watched Anya, her composed exterior masking an inner turmoil mirrored in her haunted eyes. He saw the years of absence reflected there, the yearning for connection that he had unknowingly, cruelly denied. He finally stood, the movement hesitant, his usual decisive confidence replaced by an uncertain fragility. He walked to the window, the cityscape a blurry canvas of lights and shadows, reflecting the conflicting emotions churning within him. His back to Anya and Leo, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I remember fragments. A face in a crowded bar. A fleeting moment of intimacy. Then nothing. Years of nothing. His voice cracked, the unshed tears a testament to the weight of his past actions. A silent apology for the years of absence. The scent of lilies, usually a calming presence, now seemed to mock the turmoil in the room. Anya watched him, her heart heavy with a complex mix of anger, sadness, and a flickering spark of hope. The forgotten past, suddenly revealed, was a raw wound that needed time to heal. But in the silence, a fragile thread of understanding began to form, a quiet acknowledgement of the pain and the possibility of a future they could create together. The weight of the revelation still pressed down, but it was not an insurmountable burden. There was something else in the air now, too. A nascent hope, possibility. The penthouse suite, usually a beacon of calm luxury, felt suffocating. The scent of lilies, normally soothing, now hung heavy, a cloying sweetness against the bitter taste of revelation. Julian paced, the polished marble floor cold beneath his bare feet. His tailored suit, usually a symbol of power, felt like a cage. He stopped, his reflection in the glass wall a stranger, haggard, haunted. It's impossible, he muttered, his voice barely audible above the city's distant hum. The weight of his denial was palpable, a physical pressure crushing him. Leo, curled up on the sofa with Anya, watched him with wide, worried eyes. Anya, however, remained remarkably composed, her usual warmth tempered by a controlled anger. She sat, arms wrapped around Leo, a silent shield against Julian's turmoil. The soft glow of the evening sun cast long shadows across the room, highlighting the stark contrast between their reactions. Impossible. Anya's voice was low, steady, yet laced with an undercurrent of steel. The DNA results don't lie, Julian. 23 years, and this is how you choose to react. Her voice, though controlled, carried a sharp edge, a clear indication of her building frustration. Julian flinched. Her words, though harsh, held a truth he couldn't ignore. The fragments of memory, previously dismissed as fleeting hallucinations, now coalesced into a blurry but undeniable image. A laughing girl, the touch of her hand, a shared night of careless passion. Shame washed over him, a bitter tide eroding his carefully constructed facade. He looked at Leo, his son's anxious gaze mirroring his own internal turmoil. The boy, usually so full of life, was subdued, his usual playful energy replaced by a quiet apprehension. Julian felt a fresh wave of guilt, a profound understanding of the damage his actions had caused. The comfortable silence he usually craved felt like a suffocating blanket, a stark contrast to the chaos within his soul. He was adrift, lost in a sea of his own making, the once familiar waters of his life transformed into a turbulent, unforgiving ocean. He had to find his way back, not just for himself, but for the two people he had so carelessly hurt. The weight of his responsibility settled heavily on his shoulders, a burden he could no longer ignore. Anya's voice, though quiet, carried the weight of unshed tears. The penthouse suite, despite its opulence, felt claustrophobic, the air thick with unspoken accusations. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden rays, a fragile beauty against the backdrop of Julian's turmoil. He stared at his hands, the expensive fabric of his suit suddenly scratchy and uncomfortable against his skin. 23 years, she repeated, her voice catching slightly. 23 years of my life, and you didn't even know. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken resentment. She cradled Leo closer, her touch gentle but firm, a silent reassurance to the boy who watched them both with wide, frightened eyes. Julian looked up, finally meeting her gaze. He saw not just the nanny, but a woman etched with a lifetime of unspoken longing, a pain mirroring his own. The carefully constructed walls of his self-deception began to crumble. I don't have an excuse, he managed, his voice hoarse. The words felt inadequate, pathetic against the enormity of his negligence. No, Anya agreed, her voice low. You don't. But I deserve an explanation. Leo deserves to know his sister. She paused, taking a deep breath. The anger had subsided, replaced by a weariness that reached Julian across the vast chasm of his years of self-imposed isolation. He's been asking about that birthmark for weeks. Why did you avoid it? The question hit him like a physical blow. He saw the pain in Leo's eyes, the boy's trust betrayed, and his own callous avoidance became even more unbearable. He closed his eyes, the memories of his youthful indiscretions, vague, hazy, yet undeniably there, surfacing with renewed intensity. The scent of rain on warm asphalt, the hesitant touch of a young woman's hand. He remembered the fear, the panicked retreat, the subsequent years, a blur of ambition and self-absorption. Opening his eyes, he met Anya's gaze, the shame flooding him anew. I was afraid, he whispered, the confession raw and honest. Afraid of what it would mean, afraid of everything. He swallowed hard, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. I was a coward. The words hung in the air, a stark acknowledgement of his failures. The silence that followed was not oppressive, but pregnant with the weight of unspoken emotions. Leo stirred, reaching out a small hand to touch Anya's face. The simple gesture, innocent and profound, broke through the tension. Anya leaned down, her own tears now freely falling as she kissed her son's forehead. A small crack had appeared in the wall between them, a glimmer of hope in the shadowed room. The journey to reconciliation was long, but for the first time, Julian felt a path was possible. The penthouse suite, usually a sanctuary of controlled calm, felt suffocating. The scent of expensive lilies, normally a subtle perfume, now clung to the air like a cloying sweetness, a stark contrast to the bitter taste of Julian's shame. He watched Anya cradle Leo, the boy's small hand clutching hers, a poignant picture of the bond he'd so carelessly missed. Sunlight slanted across the polished marble floor, highlighting the dust motes dancing in its beams, a fragile, fleeting beauty mirroring the precariousness of their situation. 23 years, Anya repeated, her voice barely a whisper, yet each word landed like a stone. Her eyes, usually warm and engaging, held a chilling stillness, a reflection of the years lost, the hopes dashed. 23 years, and you didn't even know. Julian shifted, the expensive fabric of his suit suddenly abrasive against his skin. He felt the weight of his silence, the crushing burden of his self-imposed ignorance. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat, choked by the rising tide of his guilt. He could only manage a weak "I." The inadequacy of the single syllable echoed the hollowness of his life until now. Leo, sensing the tension, stirred, his small hand reaching out to touch Anya's face. The gesture, simple yet profound, broke through the suffocating silence, a tiny crack in the wall of his father's carefully constructed denial. Anya leaned down, her own tears finally spilling, a release of years of pent-up emotion. The kiss she pressed to Leo's forehead was a silent testament to the love that had somehow blossomed in the midst of this unexpected chaos. He's been asking about the birthmark for weeks, Anya said, her voice still trembling, but with a newfound strength. Why did you avoid it? Why didn't you even consider? Her voice trailed off, the unspoken question hanging heavy in the air. Why didn't you consider the possibility that this incredibly kind, compassionate woman who'd instantly bonded with your son might be your daughter? The question hit Julian like a physical blow, the force of it rattling him to his core. He saw the pain mirrored in Leo's wide, questioning eyes, a painful reflection of his own negligence. His avoidance, once a shield against the unknown, now felt like a brutal betrayal of the very people he was supposed to protect. He closed his eyes, the fragmented memories of that summer hazy, fragmented, yet undeniably present, flooding back. The The scent of rain-slicked streets, the hesitant touch of a young woman's hand, the fear, the panicked retreat, the subsequent years of blinding ambition, self-absorption, a deliberate blotting out of a significant part of his life. Opening his eyes, he met Anya's gaze, the shame searing him anew. "I was afraid," he whispered, the confession raw and vulnerable. Afraid of what it would mean, afraid of everything. He swallowed hard, the words a testament to the years of repressed emotions, the agonizing self-deception. "I was a coward." Anya's voice, though low, carried the weight of 23 years of unspoken longing. The penthouse, usually a sterile display of wealth, felt suffocatingly small. Sunlight, filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminated dust motes dancing in the air, each a tiny, shimmering testament to the passage of time Julian had so carelessly wasted. He watched Leo, nestled against Anya, his small hand clutching hers, a bond he'd unknowingly fostered, then brutally ignored. "It wasn't just the birthmark," Anya continued, her gaze steady, unwavering. "It was everything. The way he looked at you, the way you avoided him." Her voice cracked, the carefully constructed dam of composure finally breaking. Tears streamed down her cheeks, mirroring the silent torrent of emotion flooding Julian's own heart. He wanted to reach for her, to offer the comfort he'd denied her for so long, but the weight of his guilt held him paralyzed. He saw the reflection of his own fear in her eyes, the fear of rejection, the fear of abandonment, the fear of being unwanted. He'd been so consumed by his own fears, his own ambitions, that he'd blinded himself to the potential love he'd been so close to. I didn't know," he stammered, the words inadequate, pathetic. The truth, brutal in its simplicity, hung heavy in the air. His confession wasn't just an admission of his past mistake. It was an acknowledgement of his present failure. He had failed as a lover, as a father, and as a man. Anya looked at Leo, her expression softening. The raw pain in her eyes was replaced by a quiet determination. "He deserves to know his father," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the gentle sobs escaping her lips. "And I deserve to know mine." The statement, simple yet profound, held the weight of a lifetime's yearning. It wasn't just a plea for recognition. It was a declaration of her own strength, her own resilience, her refusal to be a victim of his negligence. The silence that followed was a heavy blanket, thick with unspoken emotions, with the weight of regret, the possibility of redemption, the precarious hope of a future forged from the wreckage of the past. The scent of lilies, once cloying, now seemed to fade, replaced by the scent of possibility, however faint. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, punctuated only by Leo's soft breathing. The penthouse, usually a symphony of muted elegance, felt stark, its polished surfaces reflecting the raw emotion in the room. Anya's tears, catching the light, looked like scattered diamonds against her pale skin. Julian, rooted to the spot, felt the cold weight of his past pressing down on him, a crushing burden of forgotten years. He finally moved, the action clumsy and hesitant. He knelt before Anya, the polished marble floor cold against his knees. "Anya," he began, his voice a rough rasp. I don't know what to say." The words felt hollow, inadequate to the magnitude of his failure. Anya didn't answer immediately. She looked at Leo, her face a mask of weary sadness, then back at Julian. The intensity of her gaze was unnerving. "You say nothing," she finally replied, her voice barely a whisper, tinged with bitter resignation. "For 23 years you said nothing, and now, faced with the truth, you still don't know what to say." He reached out a trembling hand, wanting to touch her, to offer some small measure of comfort, but stopped, unsure of his welcome. The unspoken accusation hung heavy between them, a tangible barrier. The scent of lilies from the oversized vase in the corner suddenly felt cloying, suffocating. He longed for the fresh air, the cleansing rain he'd been so oblivious to for so many years. I'm sorry," he managed, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. The apology felt inadequate, hollow, but it was all he could offer. He saw a flicker of something in Anya's eyes, a tiny spark of hope, perhaps? Or was it simply the reflection of his desperate plea? Anya's gaze softened, just slightly. "Sorry isn't enough, Julian," she said. Her voice still laced with pain, but a hint of something else, something akin to understanding, edged into the sorrow. "But maybe it's a start." The subtle shift in her tone, a crack in the fortress of her hurt, gave Julian a fragile glimmer of hope. The weight on his chest, though still heavy, felt slightly less crushing. He had a long way to go, a mountain of regret to climb, but perhaps, just perhaps, he could begin the ascent. The faintest hint of a smile played on her lips, a fragile butterfly emerging from a cocoon of pain. The future remained uncertain, a vast unknown, but for the first time, he felt a flicker of warmth, a possibility of connection, a tentative step towards forgiveness. The penthouse suite, usually a haven of cool calm, felt stifling. Sunlight, usually filtering softly through the floor-to-ceiling windows, now seemed harsh, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the heavy silence. Julian watched Anya, the lines etched around her eyes a stark contrast to her composed exterior. He saw the suppressed anger simmering beneath the surface, a fragile truce holding back a storm. I understand," Julian began, his voice a low rumble against the quiet hum of the city far below. He shifted on the plush sofa, the deep cushions offering little comfort to his restless spirit. The scent of Anya's perfume, a subtle blend of jasmine and sandalwood, was both familiar and alien, a ghostly reminder of a life he'd forgotten. Anya's silence was more potent than any outburst. She traced the rim of a crystal glass, the delicate clinking a counterpoint to the turmoil within her. "Understanding isn't enough, Julian," she finally said, her voice low and controlled, but the tremor in her hands betrayed her composure. 23 years, a lifetime lost, a life I've lived, unaware." He reached for her hand, his touch hesitant, almost apologetic. Her skin, cool and smooth under his, felt both familiar and distant. The contact seemed to bridge a chasm, however slightly. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he confessed, his voice thick with emotion. "But I beg you to understand the extent of my regret. The amnesia, it wasn't an excuse, but a cruel twist of fate." Anya met his gaze, her eyes, the same startling green as Leo's, mirroring the storm raging within her. "Fate or negligence?" she challenged softly. The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusations. He saw a flicker of something else in her eyes, not just anger, but a raw vulnerability, a painful longing for the father she'd never had. The weight of his actions bore down on him, crushing him under the weight of his past mistakes. He had to do better. He had to make amends. "Both," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "I was young, reckless, irresponsible, and now I must face the consequences." He paused, gathering his courage, the silence stretching, thick and suffocating again before he continued. "I will do everything in my power to make things right. For you, for Leo." The words were a promise, a pledge, heavy with the weight of his newfound responsibility. The silence following his words held a different quality now. It felt less charged with anger, more pregnant with the possibility of healing. The faintest of smiles touched Anya's lips. It was a tentative step, a crack in the ice of her hurt, but it was a beginning. The penthouse, usually a sanctuary of polished surfaces and muted tones, felt stark under the afternoon sun. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light, highlighting the silence hanging heavy between Julian and Anya. He watched her, the subtle tremor in her hands betraying the composure she so carefully maintained. The jasmine and sandalwood of her perfume, once alluring, now felt like a poignant reminder of his negligence. 23 years, Anya repeated, her voice barely a whisper, the words hanging in the air like fragile shards of glass. A lifetime stolen. And for what? She didn't need to elaborate. The unspoken accusation hung between them, thick and suffocating. Julian shifted, the plush sofa offering little comfort. He wanted to reach for her, to offer solace, but fear held him back. Her anger, he understood, was justified. But beneath the anger, he saw something else, a deep, wounded longing. A need for connection, for the father she never knew. "I know there are no excuses," he began, his voice hoarse. "The amnesia, it was a cruel twist, but it doesn't absolve me of my responsibility. I was young, selfish, reckless." He paused, searching for the right words, words that could possibly bridge the chasm between them. "I failed you, Anya, and I failed Leo." Anya met his gaze, her green eyes, the same startling shade as Leo's, filled with a complex mix of hurt and something akin to hope, a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, he could make amends. "Then make amends, Julian," she said, her voice steadier now, laced with a quiet determination. "Not with words, but with actions. Show me you understand. Show me you're not just the billionaire who forgot his daughter, but a father who finally wants to know her." He nodded, a single, resolute movement. The weight of his responsibility settled upon his shoulders, heavy but no longer crushing. He looked at her, truly looked at her, seeing not just the nanny, but his daughter, his lost daughter, finally found. The path ahead was daunting, filled with challenges and uncertainty. But for the first time in a long time, Julian felt a surge of hope. A hope fueled by responsibility, regret, and a burgeoning love he hadn't known he could feel. The silence that followed wasn't suffocating anymore. It felt pregnant with possibility, the beginning of healing. The penthouse suite, usually a sterile display of wealth, felt strangely intimate under the soft glow of the evening lamps. Rain lashed against the panoramic windows, mirroring the storm brewing inside Julian. He poured 2 glasses of wine, the clinking crystal a sharp contrast to the quiet tension. He offered one to Anya, her hand trembling slightly as she accepted. This is hard," Julian began, his voice thick with unshed tears. He swirled the wine, the ruby liquid mimicking the turmoil within him. "I don't even know where to start." Anya watched him, her gaze steady yet filled with a heartbreaking weariness. "Start with the truth," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the drumming rain. "Start with what you remember, however fragmented it may be." He took a deep breath, the scent of the wine, a rich Cabernet Sauvignon, a momentary distraction from the weight of his confession. He spoke of a carefree college night, a fleeting encounter, a girl with laughing eyes and fiery red hair. A girl he'd completely forgotten. The memory, when it surfaced, hit him with the force of a physical blow. The guilt, the self-loathing were almost unbearable. I buried it," he admitted, his voice breaking. "I buried it so deep. I convinced myself it never happened. Until Leo." He trailed off, unable to articulate the overwhelming sense of loss and regret that consumed him. Anya nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes. "The birthmark," she said softly, tracing a finger across her own. A mirror image of Leo's. It was always there, a silent reminder of a connection I never understood. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, a testament to years of unspoken longing. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words, unlived years. The rain continued its relentless assault, but inside the penthouse, a different kind of storm was beginning to subside. A storm of guilt, of denial, replaced by the fragile hope of reconciliation. The wine, half forgotten, sat untouched on the table, a symbol of a life slowly, painfully, being rebuilt. The path to healing wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, father and daughter were finally facing it together. The following morning, sunlight sliced through the penthouse's floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Julian sat on the edge of his bed, the remnants of last night's Cabernet Sauvignon still staining the crystal glass. His head throbbed, a dull ache mirroring the turmoil in his soul. He glanced at the empty space beside him, where Anya had sat only hours before. The silence was deafening. He finally rose, the plush carpet cushioning his bare feet. The penthouse, usually a symbol of his success, felt like a gilded cage. He went to the balcony, the cool morning air a stark contrast to the stifling guilt weighing on him. Below, the city hummed with its usual frenetic energy, a world utterly detached from the emotional upheaval in his life. A knock on the door startled him. It was Leo, his small hand clutching a worn teddy bear. "Daddy?" Leo whispered, his voice hushed with a cautiousness that tugged at Julian's heart. "Are you okay?" Julian knelt, pulling his son into a hug, the warmth of his small body a comfort. I'm trying to be, sweetheart," he murmured, the words catching in his throat. The weight of his revelation hung heavy between them, an unspoken truth that permeated their embrace. "Anya's sad," Leo said, his voice barely a whisper. "She's in the kitchen. She made pancakes." Julian's heart lurched. He looked at Leo, his son's innocent concern a sharp reminder of the damage he'd caused. He rose, a newfound resolve hardening his gaze. He couldn't continue to hide. He had to face his daughter, face the truth, and begin to rebuild what he had so carelessly shattered. The pancakes, a simple gesture of normalcy in the face of extraordinary upheaval, suddenly seemed like a lifeline. He took a deep breath, steeling himself, and walked toward the kitchen, the scent of maple syrup a bittersweet promise of a fragile reconciliation. The kitchen, usually bright and airy, felt dim and hushed. Anya stood by the counter, her back to him, the scent of maple syrup oddly melancholic. The pancakes, a stack of golden perfection, sat untouched. Julian watched her, the silence amplifying the unspoken accusations hanging between them. He noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she carefully wiped down the counter, a small, almost imperceptible gesture that spoke volumes. He cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the quiet space. Anya didn't turn. "Anya," he began, his voice rough with unshed tears. The words felt clumsy, inadequate, yet they were a start. She finally turned. Her eyes, usually bright and full of life, were clouded with a sadness that mirrored his own. I didn't expect this," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the refrigerator. "Neither did I," he admitted, his voice catching. He approached her cautiously, the distance between them feeling vast despite the small space. He wanted to reach out, to touch her, but hesitated, unsure of what his gesture would communicate. Fear, he realized, was a powerful force, paralyzing him with its cold grip. "It's a lot to process," she said, her gaze drifting to the untouched pancakes. The unspoken hung heavy between them. The years of absence, the sudden revelation, the fractured expectations. He watched her, this woman who was both a stranger and a deeply familiar part of his life. He saw a flicker of the hurt he'd caused reflected in her eyes. A hurt he understood viscerally. He wanted to explain, to apologize, to somehow undo the damage, but the words eluded him. The weight of his past mistakes pressed down on him, crushing him beneath its immense weight. He had been so lost in the world of his own making, so blinded by ambition and success that he had missed the most precious things. Family, connection, love. Now, the price of his negligence threatened to tear everything apart. He needed to find a way to mend these broken pieces, to build a relationship from the ashes of his past. He took a deep breath, the scent of maple syrup suddenly sweet and poignant, a reminder of the simple joys he had almost allowed to slip away. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he gently touched her arm. "I understand," he began, his voice choked with emotion. "And I'm so sorry." The following morning, sunlight streamed through the expansive windows of Julian's study, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Anya sat on the plush, velvet armchair, a steaming mug of tea warming her hands. The silence was thick, heavy with unspoken emotions. Julian paced, the polished wood floor echoing his restless energy. He stopped, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. The scent of old leather and expensive cigars hung in the air, a stark contrast to the delicate floral scent of Anya's tea. I need to understand," Julian finally said, his voice hoarse. He avoided her gaze, focusing on a framed photograph of a younger, carefree him, a life before the weight of his empire, before the revelation that shattered his carefully constructed world. Anya met his gaze, her eyes reflecting the conflict raging within her. Understand what, Julian? That you forgot about me? That you hired me as your son's nanny, without ever recognizing your own daughter? Her voice was quiet, controlled, but the underlying pain was palpable. The bitter tang of unshed tears clung to the back of her throat. He winced, the pain in her words hitting him harder than any accusation. "No," he said, his voice strained. "I need to understand how I could be so blind, so negligent." He ran a hand across his face, the lines etching deeper with each passing moment. "How could I not remember?" Anya took a slow sip of her tea, the warmth a small comfort against the chill that settled deep in her bones. "Maybe," she said softly, "some things are better left forgotten." The words hung in the air, a quiet acceptance laced with resignation. Julian stopped pacing. He looked at Anya, truly looked at her, seeing past the nanny, past the carefully constructed facade she presented to the world, and saw the hurt, the confusion, the lingering hope in her eyes. The image of his younger self, careless and irresponsible, haunted him. The weight of his past actions crashed down on him once more. He realized he'd forgotten more than just her existence. He had forgotten the essence of what it meant to be a father, a man, a human being capable of love and connection. "No," he said again, this time with conviction. "That's not acceptable. I need to fix this. I need to be a father to you, to both of you." He looked at her with a newfound determination, a resolve that shone through the years of accumulated guilt. The fear that had paralyzed him earlier had begun to dissipate, replaced by a burgeoning hope, a desperate need to make amends. The silence that followed was different now, less heavy, infused with a fragile, nascent understanding. The scent of maple syrup from the day before seemed to linger, a faint promise of sweetness amidst the bitter truth. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee fought a losing battle against the lingering scent of Anya's lilac perfume. Julian sat at his expansive mahogany desk, the weight of his revelation pressing down on him like a physical burden. He stared at the DNA report, the stark black and white a stark contrast to the vibrant chaos of his life. He'd spent the night wrestling with his conscience, the ghost of his younger self taunting him with careless choices. Anya entered, her movements quiet, almost hesitant. The morning light caught the delicate gold threads woven into her hair, a detail he'd never noticed before. He watched her, truly saw her, a woman burdened by a secret she'd carried for years. "Good morning," she said, her voice barely a whisper, tinged with a fragility that tugged at his heart. She avoided his gaze, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Julian cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the cavernous room. "Anya," he began, his voice rough, I need to talk." He watched as her shoulders slumped, the small gesture betraying a weariness that resonated deeply within him. "I know," she replied, her voice barely above a breath. Her eyes, usually sparkling with warmth and intelligence, held a deep, abiding sadness. "I've been waiting for you to say something." He pushed his chair back, the metallic screech jarring in the quiet room. He stood, the movement symbolic of his intention to face his past. "About last night, about the test results. I didn't know." His words felt inadequate, clumsy, failing to capture the torrent of emotions swirling within him. Anya's eyes met his, a mixture of pain and quiet understanding reflected in their depths. "I know you didn't, Julian, but you do now." The simple statement held the weight of years of unspoken longing, of a father-daughter bond denied. The unspoken question hung in the air, what now? The scent of lilac and old leather mingled, a potent symbol of their unexpected, complicated reality. The weight of his past actions pressed down on him, a heavy cloak of guilt he could no longer ignore. He had to find a way to begin to make amends. The journey would be long, filled with obstacles, but he would start today. He would begin by honestly confronting Anya and begin the difficult work of building a relationship with the daughter he'd never known. Julian's attempts to reach Anya were met with a wall of polite distance. He found her in the garden, Leo clinging to her leg, building a miniature sandcastle. The afternoon sun cast long shadows, the air thick with the scent of honeysuckle and freshly cut grass. He watched them, a pang of longing twisting in his chest. He wanted to join them, to be part of their easy camaraderie, but the chasm between them felt unbridgeable. "Anya," he began, his voice hesitant, breaking the comfortable silence. Leo looked up, his bright eyes questioning. Anya didn't turn, her fingers smoothing Leo's damp hair. "Yes, Julian?" Her tone was civil, professional, devoid of the warmth he'd once seen in her eyes. About last night," he stammered, the words catching in his throat. I wanted to apologize." He felt clumsy, inadequate, his carefully chosen words failing to express the depth of his regret. She finally turned, her gaze steady, unflinching. The afternoon light illuminated the faint lines of worry etched around her eyes, highlighting the fatigue beneath her composed exterior. "For what, Julian? For forgetting me?" Her voice was low, controlled, but a tremor ran through it, betraying the raw emotion beneath. The accusation hung between them, sharp and painful. He felt a fresh wave of guilt wash over him. He'd known, logically, that she would be hurt, but the depth of her pain, the quiet dignity with which she bore it, struck him with the force of a physical blow. He wanted to reach out, to touch her hand, but he hesitated, unsure of how she'd react. He sank onto the grass beside them, the cool earth grounding him. "For everything," he said finally, his voice husky. "For my negligence, my ignorance. For everything I didn't do." He looked at Leo, who was watching them with wide, curious eyes, his small hand gripping Anya's. Anya met his gaze, her expression unreadable. A long silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the gentle lapping of waves against the shore nearby. The air hung heavy with unspoken emotions, a potent mixture of grief, regret, and a fragile hope. He needed to bridge this gap, to rebuild the trust that he'd so carelessly shattered. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he had to try. For Anya, for Leo, for himself. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, a breathtaking backdrop to the silent battle waged in their hearts. The business crisis hit like a tidal wave. Julian, thrown back into the frantic rhythm of board meetings and frantic phone calls, retreated into his work cocoon. The quiet evenings spent with Leo and Anya, the tentative steps toward reconciliation, were swallowed by the relentless demands of his empire. The honeysuckle scent of the garden was replaced by the sterile, artificial aroma of his office. The comforting sound of Leo's laughter drowned out by the harsh ring of the telephone. Anya watched, a familiar ache settling in her chest. The man who had finally begun to see her, to acknowledge her, was disappearing again, retreating behind the impenetrable wall of his ambition. She understood the pressure, the weight of responsibility he carried, but the familiar sting of abandonment was sharp and unwelcome. Leo, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, clung to her more tightly, his silence a poignant reflection of his own unspoken fears. One evening, Julian stumbled home, his eyes bloodshot, his face etched with exhaustion. He collapsed onto the sofa, the weight of his failures heavy on his shoulders. Anya approached cautiously, her heart a tight knot of worry and resentment. "Julian," she began, her voice soft yet firm, "this isn't working." He looked up, his gaze clouded with fatigue and self-recrimination. "I know," he mumbled, his voice hoarse. I'm losing it." "Losing what, Julian?" Her voice trembled slightly. "Your company? Or your family?" The question hung in the air, stark and accusatory. He closed his eyes, the silence filled with the unspoken words, the unspoken regrets. The weight of his negligence, his past mistakes, pressed down on him with crushing force. He wanted to explain, to justify, but the words failed him. He only saw the hurt in her eyes, a reflection of the pain he had caused. The faint scent of his expensive cologne couldn't mask the raw exhaustion clinging to him. His shoulders slumped, defeated. The battle between his workaholic tendencies and his newfound desire to be a father raged within him, leaving him exhausted and vulnerable. The future hung precariously in the balance, a fragile bridge built on the shifting sands of his past. The cool night air did little to soothe the burning anger simmering within Anya. Julian's retreat back into the suffocating world of his business had left a chasm between them, a silence deeper and more chilling than any argument. She watched him from the kitchen window, the faint glow of the city lights painting his slumped figure in shades of gray. The scent of rain, sharp and clean, did nothing to wash away the bitter taste of disappointment. "He's losing himself again," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. Leo, curled up on the sofa, stirred slightly, his small hand clutching a worn teddy bear. The next morning, Anya found Julian hunched over his laptop, his face pale and drawn. The air hung heavy with the unspoken accusations. The usual crisp scent of his cologne was absent, replaced by the stale smell of old coffee and desperation. He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed, devoid of their usual sharp intensity. "Anya," he began, his voice a low rasp, I need to talk." She met his gaze, her own eyes a storm of conflicting emotions. "Talk, Julian," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Because your silence is deafening." He pushed away from the desk, the metallic clang of his chair echoing in the quiet room. The weight of his failures pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating. He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair, the gesture revealing his exhaustion. "I'm sorry," he said, the words barely a breath. "I let things get away from me. Again." Anya saw a flicker of genuine remorse in his eyes, a fragile spark of hope amidst the ruins of his self-destruction. But hope was a precarious thing easily extinguished. She needed more than words, more than empty apologies. She needed action. She needed him to choose them, choose his family over his empire. The weight of this realization hung heavily in the air between them. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken fears and unspoken needs. The ticking clock was a stark reminder of the precious time slipping away. The scent of the honeysuckle from the garden drifted in, a fragile testament to the beauty and serenity he was so readily discarding. The choice, she knew, rested squarely on his shoulders. And the clock was ticking. The tension in the air crackled like static electricity. Sunlight streamed through the expansive windows of Julian's office, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the golden beams, a stark contrast to the storm raging within him. Anya sat opposite him, her posture rigid, a fragile mask of composure barely concealing the simmering hurt in her eyes. The scent of lilies, usually a soothing presence, felt suffocatingly sweet, mirroring the cloying sweetness of his previous apologies. "I understand you need time," Anya began, her voice low, measured, each word carefully chosen. "But time is something neither Leo nor I have in abundance. This isn't just a business deal, Julian. This is us." She gestured between them, her hand trembling slightly. Julian flinched, the word us hitting him like a physical blow. The polished mahogany of his desk felt cold and unforgiving beneath his fingertips. He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture weary, defeated. The faint scent of his expensive cologne was overpowered by the bitter tang of unshed tears. "I know," he mumbled, his gaze fixed on the intricate knot of his tie, avoiding her eyes. "But the company—" His voice trailed off, the familiar excuse hanging limply in the air. Anya's breath hitched. "Your company?" she repeated, her voice laced with a quiet fury. "Always your company. What about your son? What about me?" The last word escaped almost as a whisper, a raw, vulnerable plea lost in the cavernous silence of the office. He looked up, his eyes filled with a desperate remorse that cut through the layers of his self-imposed armor. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, a crushing burden of neglect and denial. He saw the reflection of his own failings in her hurt gaze, the image a searing indictment of his choices. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the distant hum of the city. The opulent surroundings, usually a source of comfort and control, felt claustrophobic, a gilded cage of his own making. He reached across the desk, his hand hovering over hers. The gesture was hesitant, tentative, a fragile bridge across the chasm of their fractured relationship. I'm trying," he choked out, his voice thick with unshed tears. The words were weak, inadequate, yet they held a glimmer of truth, a flicker of the man he longed to be. He needed to show her, needed to prove his commitment to them wasn't simply words in the face of a crisis. The clock was ticking. The future of his family hung precariously in the balance. This time, he wouldn't let it slip away. The mahogany desk felt cold beneath Julian's trembling hands. Anya's quiet fury hung in the air, thick and sharp as the scent of ozone before a storm. He saw the hurt etched into her face, the subtle tightening of her jaw, the way her usually vibrant eyes were clouded with a deep, weary sadness. The opulent office, usually a sanctuary of control, felt like a suffocating prison. "The company, it's facing a major crisis," he began, his voice a strained whisper. This isn't the time." Anya's laugh was devoid of humor, a brittle sound that echoed the fragility of their situation. Always the company, Julian. Always a convenient excuse. She stood, her movement graceful despite the tension radiating from her. The soft rustle of her silk blouse seemed to amplify the silence that followed. She walked to the window, the cityscape spread out below like a glittering tapestry. "Leo deserves better," she said, her voice barely above a breath. "He deserves a father who isn't consumed by his work, a father who remembers him." The words pierced him, sharp and precise. He saw Leo's small, hopeful face, his unwavering belief in his father, and a fresh wave of guilt washed over him, drowning him in self-reproach. The weight of his neglect, the years of missed opportunities, pressed down on him with crushing force. He stood abruptly, knocking over a crystal decanter. The sharp shatter of glass was a fitting metaphor for the shattering of his carefully constructed world. He knelt, his fingers tracing the shards on the polished floor, his gaze fixed on the broken pieces. "I know," he finally said, his voice raw with emotion. "I've been a fool." Anya remained by the window, her back to him. The city lights twinkled, oblivious to the emotional earthquake unfolding in the room. The silence stretched, filled only with the faint hum of the air conditioning and the rhythmic thud of his own racing heart. He wanted to reach out, to touch her, but fear held him back. The fear of rejection, the fear of failing again. The fear that if he let himself truly feel, the pain would be unbearable. Yet, in that moment, the fear of losing her, of losing his daughter and his son, surpassed all others. He rose, his movements slow and deliberate, and walked towards her. He stopped a few feet away, letting the weight of his words hang between them. "I will change," he said, his voice low and steady. "For you, for Leo." He looked into her eyes, the pain and remorse in his own mirroring her own wounds. He extended his hand, a silent offering of peace, of hope. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Julian's penthouse, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The city below hummed with a frenetic energy, a stark contrast to the quiet turmoil within Julian's heart. He'd spent the night wrestling with his conscience, the shards of the broken decanter a poignant symbol of his shattered life. The guilt gnawed at him, a relentless beast feeding on his remorse. Leo, blissfully unaware of the adult drama unfolding around him, bounced into the room, his small hand clutching a worn teddy bear. "Daddy, Anya says we can make pancakes." His bright smile was a beacon in Julian's storm-tossed soul. Anya emerged from the kitchen, her eyes holding a cautious hope. The tension from the previous evening still lingered, a palpable presence in the spacious apartment. The aroma of maple syrup and warm batter filled the air, a comforting counterpoint to the emotional upheaval. "Good morning, sweetheart," Julian said, his voice rough but surprisingly gentle. He knelt, his gaze meeting Leo's. The small boy's trusting eyes were a powerful catalyst for change. "Morning, Daddy," Leo replied, snuggling into Julian's embrace. The simple act, once a perfunctory gesture, now felt profoundly significant. Over pancakes, a fragile peace settled. Julian watched Anya, her movements graceful, her touch gentle as she helped Leo with his syrup. The shared meal was a small step, yet it felt momentous, a fragile bridge connecting him to the daughter he had lost and rediscovered. He saw glimpses of himself in Anya, the same stubborn chin, the same determined set to her jaw. The resemblance was undeniable, a painful reminder of his past negligence. Later, he found Anya in the garden, tending to the vibrant flowers. He approached cautiously, his heart pounding a nervous rhythm against his ribs. The scent of roses and damp earth filled the air, a sensory balm to his troubled mind. I wanted to apologize," he began, his voice hesitant, "for last night, for everything." Anya turned, her expression unreadable. The morning sun caught the delicate curve of her cheek, highlighting the subtle lines etched by worry and uncertainty. "An apology won't erase the years of silence, Julian," she replied, her voice soft yet firm. "But it's a start." The faintest hint of a smile played on her lips. A flicker of hope sparked in Julian's chest, fragile but persistent. He knew the road to reconciliation would be long and arduous, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of genuine optimism. He was ready to fight for his family, for the daughter he'd never known, and for the son he'd almost lost. The crisp autumn air bit at Julian's cheeks as he watched Anya and Leo build a magnificent sandcastle on the beach. The rhythmic swoosh of the waves provided a soothing counterpoint to the turmoil still simmering within him. Leo, his cheeks rosy with exertion, shrieked with laughter as a small wave playfully threatened to topple their creation. Anya, her hair whipped by the wind, effortlessly scooped up the collapsing sand, her movements fluid and graceful. The sight filled Julian with a profound sense of longing, a longing for the years he'd missed, the moments he'd stolen from himself, and ultimately, from them. Later, huddled around a crackling bonfire, the salty air carrying the scent of wood smoke and roasting marshmallows, a tentative intimacy bloomed. Leo, nestled between his father and sister, recounted his day's adventures with an infectious enthusiasm. Anya, her gaze softening as she looked at Julian, smiled a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "He's quite the builder," she murmured, her voice low and husky, her words drifting on the sea breeze. Julian nodded, a lump forming in his throat. He'd been a terrible builder of relationships, a master of constructing corporate empires, but a failure at the most fundamental human connection. This simple shared moment, this fragile piece, felt monumental. I'm trying," Julian said, his voice a low rumble against the crackling fire. "Trying to be a better father." The words felt awkward, clumsy, yet he felt a surprising surge of hope. Anya met his gaze, her eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "I know," she replied softly, her voice a gentle counterpoint to the roar of the ocean. "And it means a lot." The unspoken words hung heavy in the air, years of silence, of hurt, of unspoken longing. Yet, in the warmth of the firelight, amidst the comforting chaos of family, a glimmer of healing began. The sandcastle, a transient monument to their shared afternoon, stood as a symbol of their fragile, yet growing, foundation. The following weeks were a blur of hesitant steps and tentative connections. Julian, surprisingly, found solace in the mundane, reading Leo bedtime stories, a task he'd previously delegated to nannies. The scent of baby powder and Leo's small hand nestled in his own became strangely comforting. He even started to enjoy the chaotic energy of breakfast, the clatter of spoons and the cheerful babble of Anya and Leo's laughter, a stark contrast to the sterile silence of his penthouse. One rainy afternoon, huddled together in the sunroom, the scent of damp earth permeating the air, Anya and Julian played a board game with Leo. The normally cutthroat billionaire found himself genuinely engaged, his competitive spirit replaced by a quiet joy in Leo's infectious delight. He watched Anya, her brow furrowed in concentration, her fingers tracing the game pieces with a delicate touch, a faint smile playing on her lips. The warmth radiating from her was almost palpable. "Your move, Dad," Leo chirped, his eyes bright with anticipation. Julian hesitated, a rare vulnerability flickering in his eyes. He looked at Anya, then back at his son, a lifetime of missed opportunities weighing heavily on his heart. I'm not very good at this," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Anya smiled gently, her voice soft, yet firm. "It's not about winning, Julian. It's about spending time together." Her words hung in the air, a quiet affirmation of the unspoken bond slowly forming between them. Later that evening, as rain lashed against the windows, Julian found himself sitting beside Anya on the sofa, the scent of old books and wood smoke clinging to the air. The silence between them wasn't awkward, but heavy with unspoken emotions. He finally confessed, his voice thick with emotion. "I never wanted to be this distant. I just didn't know how to be a father." Anya reached out, her hand covering his, her touch unexpectedly comforting. "I know," she said softly, her gaze steady. "But you're learning." The rain outside mirrored the storm within him, a tempest of guilt and regret. But now, something new was emerging: hope. A faint, flickering ember of a possibility of a true family. The warmth of her hand held his, a promise of a brighter, albeit uncertain, future. The following weeks were a slow, careful dance of healing. Julian, surprisingly, found himself captivated by the simplest things. Leo's infectious giggle echoing through the house, the smell of Anya's lavender shampoo lingering in the air after she'd bathed Leo. He started taking Leo to the park, the metallic tang of the swings and the earthy scent of damp soil grounding him in a present he'd long ignored. One evening, after a particularly challenging day at work, Julian found Anya in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared dinner. The aroma of roasted vegetables and herbs filled the air, a comforting contrast to the sterile scent of his office. He leaned against the doorway, watching her, her movements graceful, almost balletic. "It smells amazing," he said, his voice husky. Anya smiled, a faint blush rising on her cheeks. "I tried a new recipe. Hope Leo likes it." "He'll love it," Julian murmured, unable to tear his gaze away. He felt a wave of affection wash over him, a feeling both unfamiliar and intensely comforting. "Are you all right, Dad?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. He'd noticed her using that term more often, the word a tender bridge between their newfound relationship. He hesitated, then confessed, "It's just, everything is changing so fast. I'm still adjusting." Anya nodded, understanding shimmering in her eyes. "It's okay to feel overwhelmed," she said softly. She placed a hand on his arm, her touch light yet reassuring. "We're in this together." That simple statement, brimming with unspoken support, chipped away at the wall of isolation Julian had built around himself. It felt like a silent promise, a testament to the fragile, blossoming connection between them. The warmth of her touch lingered long after she'd withdrawn her hand, a potent reminder that healing, like a slow-blooming flower, takes time, patience, and a shared willingness to nurture. The path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Julian felt a flicker of hope, warm and bright against the backdrop of his past regrets. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Anya hummed a gentle tune as she prepared Leo's breakfast, the scent of pancakes and maple syrup filling the room. Julian, still adjusting to the upheaval in his life, watched her from the doorway, a mug of lukewarm coffee warming his hands. The quiet intimacy of the scene was a stark contrast to the usual chaotic mornings. He cleared his throat, the sound breaking the peaceful silence. Anya turned, her smile hesitant. "Morning," she said softly. Her eyes, usually bright and full of life, held a shadow of weariness. "Morning," he replied, his voice rough. "Sleep well." Anya nodded, her gaze drifting towards Leo, who was engrossed in building a tower of blocks. Leo did, He's been asking about us. The unspoken words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their shared secret. Julian felt a familiar pang of guilt, a sharp reminder of the life he'd almost destroyed. He swallowed hard, the coffee suddenly tasting bitter. How is he handling it? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. He's curious, Anya replied carefully. He misses you, Dad. He misses having you around. Her voice cracked slightly on the last words, revealing a vulnerability that touched him deeply. He approached her, the distance between them shrinking with each step. He reached out, his hand hovering over hers before gently covering it. The warmth of her skin sent a jolt through him, a comforting connection that transcended the complicated layers of their relationship. I know, he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. And I miss him too, more than I can say. He squeezed her hand gently, the simple gesture communicating a depth of remorse and affection. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, but rather a quiet acknowledgement of the shared journey they were embarking upon, a testament to the fragile hope blossoming amidst the wreckage of his past. The aroma of pancakes, sweet and comforting, seemed to symbolize the sweetness of their tentative reconciliation, a promise of better days to come. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sprawling lawn as Anya and Leo built a sandcastle, its turrets already crumbling under the relentless tide of Leo's enthusiasm. The salty air, thick with the scent of seaweed and sunscreen, did little to soothe the turmoil brewing within Anya. She watched Julian, distant on a patio chair, absorbed in a tablet. The casual distance felt like a chasm. He's still withdrawn, she said softly, her voice barely audible above the playful shrieks of Leo. Julian looked up, his eyes momentarily softening before resuming their guarded expression. I'm trying, Anya. This is all new to me. He gestured vaguely towards the scene before him, the playful chaos a stark contrast to the carefully constructed walls of his usual life. The unspoken words hung heavy, his struggle with fatherhood, his guilt, his fear. Later, inside the cool, quiet house, Leo, exhausted from his castle-building exploits, drifted off to sleep. Anya found Julian in his study, surrounded by towering stacks of files, the air thick with the scent of old paper and expensive cologne. He looked up, startled. I didn't hear you come in, he mumbled, his gaze darting nervously towards a half-empty glass of scotch on his desk. Anya walked towards him, her footsteps echoing in the silent room. I wanted to talk, she said, her voice steady, betraying none of the trepidation churning inside her. About us, about Leo. He sighed, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. I know I've messed up, terribly, but I'm trying to change. I'm learning. His words sounded rehearsed, lacking the conviction she yearned to hear. Learning isn't enough, she replied, her voice gaining strength. It's not just about acknowledging the past, Julian. It's about actively building a future with Leo, with me. She met his gaze, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. The weight of years of yearning, of a life lived in the shadows, was evident in her expression. I need you to want this, not just feel obligated. Julian was silent for a long moment, the silence punctuated only by the gentle ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway. He reached for her hand, his touch hesitant, yet genuine. The warmth of his touch, the unexpected tenderness in his eyes, stirred a flicker of hope within her. The future remained uncertain, but for the first time since the revelation, Anya sensed a genuine shift, a real possibility of building a relationship founded not on duty, but on love. The scent of old books and scotch mingled with a tentative sweetness, the fragile scent of forgiveness. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden rays. Anya hummed softly, the melody a counterpoint to the rhythmic clatter of dishes. Leo, perched on a stool, meticulously arranged miniature plastic dinosaurs. Julian entered, the scent of freshly brewed coffee clinging to him like a second skin, a stark contrast to the stale scent of old files that usually clung to him. He looked different, softer somehow. Morning, he said, his voice less strained than usual. He ruffled Leo's hair, a gesture that felt genuine, not forced. Anya smiled, a genuine smile this time, not the polite facade she'd worn for weeks. "Morning," she replied. "Pancakes are almost ready." The breakfast was punctuated by quiet conversations, a shared laugh over Leo's dinosaur battle strategy, a brief, meaningful glance between Anya and Julian. It was a simple moment, yet it held the weight of unspoken emotions. Relief, hope, a tentative trust beginning to bloom. Later that day, Anya found Julian in the garden, weeding meticulously. The afternoon sun warmed their backs as they worked side by side. The silence comfortable, not heavy. The scent of earth and blooming roses filled the air. "I've been thinking," Julian said, his voice low, almost hesitant, "about everything." Anya looked up, her eyes meeting his. She saw a flicker of the old Julian, the driven, ambitious man. But there was something else too. Vulnerability, a raw honesty that had been hidden beneath layers of self-protection. "I know saying sorry isn't enough," he continued, his gaze fixed on the soil between his fingers. "But I want you to know, I am truly sorry." His voice was thick with emotion, the years of suppressed guilt weighing heavily in the air between them. Anya placed a gentle hand on his arm. "I know," she replied softly, "and I appreciate that you're trying." The weight of the past still lingered, the shadow of his past negligence still visible. Yet, the sun felt warmer, the roses smelled sweeter. There was a fragile peace settling over them, a shared understanding forged in the quiet intimacy of shared labor and unspoken forgiveness. The future remained unwritten, but for the first time, it felt hopeful, infused with the promise of a family slowly, painstakingly, piecing itself together. The aroma of chamomile tea, a scent Anya associated with calm, filled the sun-drenched conservatory. Julian, perched on a wicker chair, nervously fiddled with a chipped teacup. He hadn't expected the easy camaraderie that bloomed during their shared gardening session to translate so effortlessly indoors. The silence, however, felt thick with unspoken words. Anya, observing him, saw the familiar tension return, the tight line of his jaw, the haunted look in his eyes. "It's different, isn't it?" he finally murmured, his voice barely above a whisper, breaking the stillness. The sunlight glinted off the silver in his thinning hair. Anya nodded, her gaze lingering on his hands, calloused from his recent foray into gardening, a stark contrast to the perfectly manicured ones she was used to seeing. "Different, but better," she amended softly, her voice tinged with a tentative hope. The fear was still there, a quiet tremor beneath the surface, but a cautious optimism was starting to take root. I haven't been a good father," he confessed, his gaze dropping to his teacup. The words tumbled out, heavy with regret. "To either of you." Anya reached across the small table, her fingers brushing his. His flinched, a micro-reaction she quickly caught. "It's not too late," she said, her voice firm yet gentle. "We can build something." The sunlight warmed her face, a soft glow illuminating the genuine kindness in her eyes. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers. For a long moment, they simply sat there, the only sound the gentle ticking of an antique grandfather clock in the corner. The weight of their shared past, the burden of his long-ago negligence, hung in the air between them. Yet, in the quiet space between their unspoken words, a fragile, new understanding began to grow, a tentative step towards a future neither had dared to imagine. The faint scent of roses, lingering from their afternoon work, seemed to whisper a promise of healing, a testament to the blossoming possibility of their burgeoning relationship. The following afternoon, Leo, armed with a brightly colored drawing of a family, Anya, Julian, and himself, all grinning, presented it to his father. Julian, still grappling with the enormity of his revelation, felt a pang of guilt sharper than any business deal gone wrong. The drawing, childishly perfect, was a stark contrast to the turbulent landscape of his emotions. He swallowed, the lump in his throat catching on the unspoken words. It's beautiful, Leo, Julian managed, his voice thick with emotion. He took the drawing, his fingers tracing the crude lines of Anya's smiling face. The image, innocent and hopeful, was a powerful reminder of the life he'd almost destroyed. Later, while Anya bathed Leo, Julian sat alone in his study, the polished mahogany desk a cold comfort. He picked up a framed photograph, a younger, carefree Julian laughing with a group of friends. A fleeting memory flickered, a girl with vibrant eyes and hair the color of autumn leaves. He couldn't recall her name, her face blurred by the fog of time and alcohol. But the guilt, the crushing weight of his forgotten past, remained crystal clear. Anya emerged from the bathroom, Leo asleep in her arms. Her eyes, usually bright and lively, held a weary sadness. "He misses you, you know," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper above the gentle rhythm of Leo's breathing. Julian flinched. The distance between them, palpable and heavy, felt like a chasm he was incapable of bridging. He looked at Anya, at the subtle resemblance to Leo, the same curve of the eyebrow, the same way their lips tilted when they smiled. The realization hit him with renewed force. This wasn't just about a forgotten relationship. It was about a daughter he'd never known, a bond he'd cruelly severed before it even had a chance to form. The fear of rejection warred with an overwhelming sense of responsibility. He rose slowly, his movements hesitant, uncertain. "Anya," he began, his voice unsteady. I don't know how to do this. How to be a father." Anya's gaze softened, a flicker of understanding in her eyes. "We'll figure it out," she said, her voice calm, reassuring. "Together." The gentle rise and fall of Leo's chest, the soft glow of the nightlight, seemed to illuminate the fragile hope that bloomed in the quiet space between them. The silence, this time, held not the weight of unspoken words, but the promise of something new, something better. A fragile dawn breaking through the storm clouds of his past. The following days were a blur of hesitant steps and awkward silences. Julian, haunted by the ghost of his forgotten past, found himself drawn to Anya and Leo, yet paralyzed by the fear of ruining what little connection they had. He watched them from afar, his heart a tight knot in his chest. He observed Anya's gentle touch as she helped Leo build a castle of blocks, their laughter echoing through the cavernous hallway, a sound that both comforted and tormented him. One evening, the scent of roasted chicken and rosemary filled the air, a comforting aroma that somehow amplified the chasm between him and his family. He found Anya in the kitchen, her brow furrowed in concentration as she stirred a sauce. The soft light from the window illuminated the delicate lines of her face, a face that now held a poignant familiarity. "It smells wonderful," Julian said, his voice barely a whisper, breaking the silence that had settled heavily between them. Anya turned, her eyes widening slightly. "Thank you," she replied, her voice soft, devoid of the usual warmth. The space between them felt charged, thick with unspoken emotions. "Leo's been asking about you," she added, her gaze drifting to the hallway where Leo was engrossed in a drawing. Julian's throat tightened. "I know," he said, guilt gnawing at him. I've been a terrible father." Anya's shoulders slumped. "He doesn't understand," she said quietly, a hint of bitterness lacing her voice. "But I do, and it hurts." She turned back to the stove, the movement betraying a tremor in her hands. The clinking of the spoon against the pan was almost unbearably loud in the quiet kitchen. Julian walked closer, the scent of rosemary and chicken suddenly sharp in his nostrils. He saw the unshed tears glistening in her eyes, and his heart ached with a profound sadness he'd never experienced before. The weight of his past mistakes pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating. He reached out, hesitantly at first, then with a gathering strength, and placed his hand gently on her arm. "I know," he repeated, his voice choked with emotion, "and I'm going to try to be better. For both of you." The words were a promise, a plea, a desperate attempt to bridge the gulf that separated them. The silence that followed was different this time, lighter, pregnant with the possibility of healing. A fragile hope, like a tiny sprout pushing through hardened earth, began to bloom. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the expansive windows of Julian's penthouse, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden rays. Anya, making breakfast, hummed a quiet tune, the melody strangely melancholic. Leo, perched on a stool, watched her with wide, curious eyes. The unspoken tension from the previous night still hung in the air, a fragile piece clinging to the edges of their strained relationship. "It's quiet today," Leo observed, his voice small. Anya smiled, a flicker of something sad in her eyes. "Yes, it is," she replied, carefully flipping pancakes. The scent of maple syrup filled the kitchen, a sweet contrast to the lingering bitterness of their situation. Julian entered, his usual sharp lines softened by sleep, his eyes holding a hesitant vulnerability. He looked at them both, his gaze lingering on Anya longer than usual. The sight of them together, his son and his daughter, stirred something deep within him, a complex mixture of guilt and a nascent hope. "Morning," he said, his voice rough, as if unused to such gentleness. He sat down, watching Anya serve Leo. The clink of cutlery against plates was almost intimate after the recent storm of unspoken emotions. "Good morning," Anya responded, her voice calm, but the slight tremor in her hands betrayed her inner turmoil. She met his gaze, a silent acknowledgement of their shared burden, the weight of their hidden past pressing down on them. Later that day, Julian found himself in Leo's room, sitting on the floor surrounded by half-finished Lego creations. He awkwardly attempted to help Leo assemble a spaceship, his clumsy fingers fumbling with the tiny bricks. The shared activity, however clumsy, became a small victory, a tiny bridge across the chasm of his negligence. Leo, sensing his father's newfound effort, leaned closer, his small hand reaching out to gently correct Julian's placement of a piece. "Like this, Daddy?" Leo whispered, his voice filled with an unexpected maturity beyond his years. Julian felt a lump forming in his throat. He looked at his son, really looked at him, seeing the resemblance to Anya, and his heart ached with the depth of his past mistakes. He nodded, his eyes welling with unshed tears. The weight of his responsibility felt less crushing now, replaced by a growing sense of purpose. The fragile hope, planted the previous night, had started to take root. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sprawling lawn. Leo, usually a whirlwind of energy, sat quietly building a sandcastle, his brow furrowed in concentration. Anya watched him, a gentle smile playing on her lips. The unspoken tension between her and Julian, however, remained a palpable presence. The air hummed with a quiet understanding, a fragile truce forged in the aftermath of their tumultuous revelation. "He's different today," Anya said, her voice barely a whisper, her gaze fixed on Leo. Julian, perched on a nearby Adirondack chair, looked up, his expression unreadable. He'd spent the morning buried in paperwork, attempting to regain some control over the chaos that his life had become. The escape had been temporary. "Different how?" Julian asked, his voice rough with fatigue. Anya hesitated, calmer, more thoughtful, like he's processing everything. She picked up a small pail, the smooth plastic cool against her fingers. "It's like he's absorbing this new reality. And me." She turned to him, her eyes meeting his. Julian sighed, the sound heavy with guilt. He'd spent years building walls around his heart, walls that now seemed to crumble under the weight of his newfound family. The sandcastle, meticulously crafted by his son, stood as a stark reminder of the time he'd missed, the moments he could never reclaim. "I know," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. He watched Leo carefully place a miniature flag atop his sandcastle turret. The child's focused expression mirrored his own attempt to rebuild his life, brick by painstaking brick. Later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Julian found himself sitting beside Leo, reading him a bedtime story. He'd chosen a book about brothers, a clumsy attempt to navigate the delicate terrain of Leo's newly expanded family. Leo snuggled close, his small hand resting on Julian's. The simple act felt profound, a tangible connection after years of emotional distance. For the first time, Julian felt a true sense of peace, a quiet contentment settling deep within him. The road ahead remained long and uncertain, but he was no longer alone on the journey. He had Anya, he had Leo, and he had a second chance, to finally be the father he was always meant to be. The faint scent of salt air and sunscreen mingled with the earthy fragrance of the nearby pine trees, a comforting backdrop to the quiet intimacy of the moment. The evening air, still warm from the day's sun, carried a whisper of hope. The therapist's office smelled faintly of lavender and old books. Anya sat rigid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, the plush armchair feeling strangely alien. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, a silent ballet mirroring the turmoil within her. Dr. Eris, a kind-faced woman with warm eyes, sat opposite, her expression encouraging but not intrusive. "It's difficult," Anya began, her voice barely a whisper, the words catching in her throat, "to unpack it all, to admit how much it hurt." She swallowed, the lump in her throat a physical manifestation of her pain. Dr. Eris nodded gently. "Take your time, Anya. There's no rush." Anya closed her eyes, the image of her abandoned childhood flashing before her. A series of fleeting memories, fragmented and indistinct, yet sharp with a sense of loss. A forgotten lullaby, a half-remembered face, the lingering scent of wood smoke and fear. "My mother." She never spoke of him, of Julian. She built walls too. Walls of silence, of omission. And I built my own to protect myself, I suppose. She opened her eyes, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. Finding out he was my father, it shattered everything I thought I knew. About her, about myself, about everything. The weight of unspoken resentment, years of pent-up anger and confusion, hung heavy in the air. Dr. Eris's voice was soft, empathetic. And now, facing him, his son. It must feel overwhelming. Anya nodded, her gaze distant. "Leo, he reminds me of someone I never knew. It's both terrifying and strangely comforting. He's a mirror, reflecting a part of me I never knew existed. It's a connection I can't quite comprehend but desperately crave." She sighed, the sound a release of years of pent-up emotion. The lavender scent, once subtle, now seemed to intensify, a sharp contrast to the bitter taste of her suppressed memories. The sunlight, once comforting, now felt intrusive, exposing her vulnerability. But in the quiet understanding in Dr. Eris's eyes, she found a flicker of hope, a promise of healing, of a future where the fragmented pieces of her past could finally be pieced together. The aroma of freshly baked bread mingled with the scent of pine from the Christmas tree dominating the corner of the living room. Leo, perched on a stool, meticulously decorated a gingerbread man, his brow furrowed in concentration. Anya watched him, a smile playing on her lips. The warmth radiating from the fire in the hearth contrasted sharply with the lingering chill in her heart. A chill Julian's recent attempts at reconciliation hadn't entirely melted. "He's getting better," Anya murmured, more to herself than to Julian, who sat across the room, engrossed in a tablet but acutely aware of her presence. His fingers drummed a restless rhythm against the screen, betraying his inner turmoil. Julian looked up, his gaze meeting hers. "Better?" he asked, his voice low. The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken anxieties. He tried, God knows he'd tried, to bridge the chasm between them, to be the father he'd failed to be. But the shadow of his past, of his forgotten daughter, still loomed large. Anya nodded slowly. "Leo, he's happier, more relaxed, and I think he's starting to accept me." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "But it's not just about him, Julian. It's about us. About healing." Julian's gaze softened, a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. He set down his tablet, the click echoing in the quiet room. "I know," he said, his voice husky. He reached for a mug of steaming tea, his hand trembling slightly. The warmth of the ceramic offered little comfort to the icy knot in his gut. I understand if you can't forgive me. I don't deserve it. Anya rose and crossed the room, the soft rug cushioning her steps. She stopped before him, her expression a mixture of sadness and determination. Forgiveness. It's not something that happens overnight, she said, her voice gentle but firm. But I'm willing to try, for Leo, and for myself. The crackle of the fire seemed to emphasize the unspoken words hanging between them, the fragile hope blooming amidst the ruins of their past. The scent of pine and gingerbread, a sweet counterpoint to the bitter taste of regret. The path ahead was long, filled with potential setbacks. Yet the warmth of the fire, the sweetness of the treats, and the quiet understanding growing between them offered a faint but persistent promise of healing. The following week, Anya took Leo to the park. The crisp autumn air nipped at their cheeks, painting them rosy. Fallen leaves crunched under their boots, a symphony of rustles and whispers. Leo, usually reserved, chattered excitedly, pointing out squirrels darting across the grass. Anya watched him, a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the sun. It was the warmth of a mother's love, a feeling both unfamiliar and intensely comforting. She'd never considered herself maternal before, but the bond with Leo felt right. Later that evening, Julian found her in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared Leo's dinner. The scent of roasted chicken and rosemary filled the air, a comforting aroma that eased the tension Julian had been carrying all day. He hesitated at the doorway, his usual brisk efficiency replaced by a hesitant awkwardness. He had a wonderful time at the park, he said, his voice rougher than he intended. Anya turned, a gentle smile gracing her lips. He loves it there, she replied, her voice soft. The silence stretched between them, filled only with the gentle sizzle of the chicken in the pan. I wanted to apologize, Julian began, his gaze fixed on the floor. For my behavior, for everything. Anya's smile faltered slightly. It's a process, she said, her voice barely a whisper. The unspoken words hung between them. Regret, longing, the slow, tentative steps towards reconciliation. He'd been trying, she knew, but the weight of his past, the years of emotional neglect, were heavy burdens. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers. The apprehension in his gaze was palpable. I know, he said, his voice laced with self-reproach. It's not about apologies, is it? It's about actions, about being a father. He reached out, his hand hovering near hers. The gesture was hesitant, fragile, but it held a depth of sincerity that touched her. Anya reached for his hand, her own trembling slightly. The touch was brief, but it spoke volumes. Promise, a beginning, the warmth of the oven, the scent of rosemary, the quiet understanding in their eyes, all spoke of a tentative hope, a fragile but persistent promise of healing. The long road ahead remained, but for the first time, they were walking it together. The following weeks were a blur of tentative steps and hesitant smiles. Julian, surprisingly, abandoned late-night board meetings, trading power suits for worn jeans and the comforting aroma of freshly baked bread. He learned to braid Leo's hair, his clumsy fingers fumbling at first, then gaining a surprising dexterity. The kitchen, once a sterile space reserved for hired help, became a hub of laughter and shared meals. Anya, initially guarded, slowly thawed. The shared scent of roasting vegetables and the warmth of the fire became a comforting ritual. One evening, after a particularly successful attempt at making Leo's favorite pasta, Anya found Julian in the garden, gazing at the starlit sky. He looked older, wearier, but also softer. "It's beautiful," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes," Anya replied, joining him. The silence wasn't awkward. It was a shared space of quiet understanding. "I never really appreciated these things before," Julian confessed, a hint of self-reproach in his tone. "Too busy chasing shadows." Anya nodded, understanding perfectly. "Sometimes," she said softly, "we spend so long looking for something big, we miss the beauty in the small things." She looked at him, truly looked at him, for the first time seeing past the billionaire facade to the vulnerable man beneath. "You've changed, Julian," she observed, her voice gentle. A faint smile touched his lips. "I'm trying to," he admitted. "For Leo, and for you." He turned to her, his eyes searching hers. The years of neglect, the weight of his forgotten past, still lingered, but a new hope, fragile yet persistent, shone through. The unspoken words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken feelings, a silent promise of a future built on understanding and forgiveness. A future he was determined to build, brick by painstaking brick. The cool night air held the promise of healing, of a new beginning, a family slowly, tenderly, piecing itself back together. The crisp autumn air nipped at their cheeks as Julian, Leo, and Anya walked hand in hand through the park. The scent of fallen leaves, damp earth, and wood smoke hung sweetly in the air. Leo, clutching a brightly colored balloon, chattered excitedly about the squirrels he'd seen. Julian watched them, a warmth spreading through him that surprised even himself. This simple act of shared joy was more valuable than any boardroom victory. "Dad," Leo said, tugging at his hand, "can we get ice cream?" Julian chuckled, the sound richer and deeper than it had been months ago. "Of course, son. What kind?" Anya smiled, the worry lines etched around her eyes softened by a gentle peace. The initial awkwardness, the tense silences, the lingering hurt, it was all fading, replaced by a tentative, fragile trust. Later, back at the house, a fire crackled merrily in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Anya hummed softly as she prepared hot chocolate, the air filled with the comforting aroma of cocoa and cinnamon, a stark contrast to the sterile, impersonal atmosphere that had once permeated the Thorne household. "I found an old photo album," Julian said, hesitantly approaching Anya. He held out a worn leather-bound book, its pages filled with faded photographs of his younger self. "From college? I didn't remember much before." Anya took the album, her fingers tracing the edges of a picture showing a younger Julian, laughing, his arm around a young woman with bright, familiar eyes. A wave of emotion washed over her, a mixture of sadness, anger, and a tentative, hesitant hope. It's you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. He nodded, his gaze fixed on her, a mixture of guilt and apprehension in his eyes. I'm so sorry, Anya, for everything." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken apologies and remorse. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with a shared understanding, a silent acknowledgement of past mistakes and a nascent hope for a future built on forgiveness and love. The warm glow of the fire illuminated their faces, reflecting the tentative steps they were taking towards healing, towards a family finally whole. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the expansive windows of Julian's study, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden rays. He sat at his massive desk, the weight of the previous evening's revelations pressing heavily upon him. The leather-bound photo album lay open, a stark reminder of his past negligence. He picked up a pen, the smooth metal cool against his skin, and began to write a letter, a long overdue apology to Anya. The words flowed haltingly at first, laden with guilt and self-reproach, but gradually, a genuine remorse began to seep into his script. Later, he found Anya in the garden, Leo at her side, his small hand clasped in hers. The scent of roses and damp earth hung in the air, a peaceful contrast to the turmoil in Julian's heart. He watched them, a lump forming in his throat. Anya's smile, though hesitant, held a flicker of hope. "Anya," he began, his voice rough, I wanted to give you this." He handed her the letter, the paper crinkling slightly in his trembling hand. Anya took it, her fingers brushing his. Their eyes met, a silent exchange of unspoken emotions. Anya read the letter slowly, her expression shifting from surprise to understanding, then to a hesitant forgiveness. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not tears of anger. but of a long-held sadness finally finding release. I understand," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She looked at Leo, then back at Julian. It's a start." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lawn as they sat together, an uneasy peace settling amongst them. The air hummed with unspoken words, a quiet understanding born from shared pain and a nascent hope for a future they were only beginning to build. The journey would be long, filled with challenges and uncertainties, but for the first time in a long time, Julian felt a glimmer of optimism, a sense that perhaps, just perhaps, he could finally become the father he should have been all along. The weight on his chest hadn't entirely lifted, but it felt lighter, the burden shared, the path ahead, if uncertain, at least now, a path they were walking together. The following week, Julian orchestrated a family picnic in the sprawling gardens of his estate. The air, thick with the scent of blooming jasmine and freshly cut grass, held a fragile peace. Leo, energized by the sun, chased butterflies, his laughter echoing through the manicured lawns. Anya sat beside Julian, a wicker basket between them, the clinking of silverware a surprisingly calming counterpoint to the unspoken tension between them. The sunlight warmed her skin, yet a chill lingered in her heart. This is nice," Anya said, her voice barely a whisper, her gaze fixed on Leo. Julian watched her, his heart aching. He'd spent the past week poring over old photos, piecing together a fractured memory of a vibrant, carefree young woman, a woman he'd abandoned. "I know it's not much," he said, his voice gruff, "but I wanted to try." Anya nodded, her eyes glistening. The unspoken apology hung heavy between them, a silent acknowledgement of shared pain and the long road to healing. Leo, oblivious to their emotional turmoil, presented Anya with a dandelion clock, his bright smile a stark contrast to the somber atmosphere. "For you, Anya," he exclaimed, his innocent joy piercing the strained silence. Anya's eyes softened. She gently took the dandelion, a fragile symbol of hope taking root in the fertile ground of their burgeoning family. The afternoon sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the lawn, painting the scene in hues of orange and gold. As the darkness settled, a quiet understanding began to bloom between Julian and Anya, a fragile seed of reconciliation planted in the rich soil of forgiveness. The picnic, though fraught with unspoken words, marked a turning point, a step toward a future where their fragmented past could finally give way to a shared present. The journey was far from over, but they were walking it together. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the expansive windows of Julian's study, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the golden rays. He sat at his mahogany desk, the weight of his past pressing down on him like a physical burden. The business crisis, though resolved, had left its mark, a stark reminder of his former self-absorption. He picked up a framed photograph of Anya, a younger version, radiant with a carefree spirit, her eyes mirroring the playful light in Leo's. A pang of guilt, sharper than any business deal gone wrong, pierced his heart. He needed to do more than simply acknowledge his past. He needed to actively repair the damage. A plan began to form, meticulous and heartfelt, a stark contrast to his previous impulsive decisions. He would start small, focusing on the day-to-day interactions, building trust brick by painstaking brick. The quiet hum of his phone was a jarring interruption. It was Anya. "Good morning." Her voice, soft as the morning mist, carried a hint of uncertainty. "Morning, Anya," he replied, his voice deeper than usual, a testament to his internal struggle. I was thinking about something. Remember Leo's fascination with astrophysics?" A pause, then, "Yes. I thought we could visit the planetarium this weekend. A family outing." The words felt clumsy, inadequate for the enormity of his feelings. There was a silence, thick with unspoken emotions. Then a tentative, I'd like that, Julian." The relief in her voice was palpable. The weekend arrived bathed in sunshine, a clear, optimistic sky above. The planetarium, a sleek, modern structure, shimmered in the afternoon light. Inside, The vast dome filled with swirling stars transported them to another realm. Leo, captivated, pointed out constellations with childish enthusiasm, his innocent joy a balm to Julian's wounded soul. Anya, her gaze softened by the cosmic wonder, smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. During the show, Julian caught her looking at him, a question shimmering in her eyes. He returned her gaze, offering a small, reassuring smile, a promise whispered between them. The faint scent of popcorn mingled with the hushed awe of the visitors, creating a strange, intimate atmosphere. Leaving the planetarium, they strolled through the park, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows. Leo, exhausted but happy, fell asleep in Anya's arms. Julian watched them, a silent prayer forming in his heart. A prayer for forgiveness, for understanding, and for a future built on love and acceptance. A future he was finally determined to create. The journey was long, but for the first time he felt he was walking it, not alone, but with his daughters. The following week, Anya started subtly changing. The quiet reserve that had cloaked her since the revelation began to crack, revealing a tentative optimism. She hummed while folding Leo's laundry, the melody a cheerful counterpoint to the quiet hum of the mansion. The lines around her eyes, previously etched with worry, softened, replaced by a hesitant smile that reached her eyes when she interacted with Julian. One evening, after Leo was asleep, Julian found her in the conservatory, tending to the orchids. The air hung heavy with the scent of night-blooming jasmine and damp earth. He watched her for a moment, her movements graceful, almost meditative. "They're beautiful," he said softly, his voice echoing in the quiet space. Anya turned, startled, then smiled, a genuine smile that illuminated her face. "They need a lot of care," she replied, her voice low and husky, "just like people." The unspoken words hung between them, thick with shared history, unspoken regrets, and burgeoning hope. He noticed the faint tremor in her hands as she gently wiped a dewdrop from a velvety petal. "I've been thinking," Julian began, his voice hesitant. "About us." Anya's breath hitched. She looked away, her gaze falling on a delicate white orchid, its bloom nearly perfect. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "And I'm scared." "So am I," Julian admitted, his voice raw with emotion. He moved closer, the scent of her perfume, a blend of lavender and sandalwood, filling his senses. "But I want to try to build something real, for all of us." He reached out, his fingers brushing against hers as he gently took hold of a small trowel. Their touch lingered, a spark igniting in the quiet space between them. The fear was still there, a quiet hum beneath the surface, but it was overshadowed by something stronger. A tentative hope, a shared desire for a future they were finally ready to create together. A future where the mistakes of the past could pave the way for a stronger, more meaningful present. The orchids, silent witnesses, seemed to sway slightly, as if blessing their fragile, burgeoning connection. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the expansive windows of Julian's study, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden rays. He sat at his imposing mahogany desk, the weight of his recent revelations pressing down on him like a physical burden. The crisp scent of his morning coffee did little to soothe the turmoil within. He picked up a framed photograph, Leo, beaming, clutching a brightly colored toy truck. A pang of guilt, sharp and familiar, pierced him. He'd missed so much. A soft knock on the door. Anya entered, her usual quiet grace tempered by a hesitant vulnerability. She carried a steaming mug, the aroma of chamomile tea filling the air, a stark contrast to the bitter coffee Julian held. "I thought you might need this," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes, the same shade of hazel as Leo's, held a mixture of concern and unspoken questions. Julian looked up, startled by the unexpected kindness. He nodded, a choked sound escaping his lips. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the gentle ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. He took the mug, the warmth radiating through his hands. "Thank you," he finally managed, his voice rough with emotion. He took a sip, the calming tea a small balm to his frayed nerves. I've been thinking about what you said last night," Anya began, her voice still hesitant, "about wanting to try to build something." Julian watched her closely, searching her eyes for any hint of resentment, any lingering bitterness. He found none, only a cautious hope mirroring his own. The fear remained, a shadow lurking at the edges of their newfound connection, but it was overshadowed by something far stronger, the desire to mend the fractured pieces of their lives. "Me too," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He set down his mug, the clink echoing in the quiet room. He reached across the desk, his hand covering hers. Her skin was soft, warm beneath his touch. The silence, this time, felt different. It was a silence filled not with tension, but with a shared understanding, a silent acknowledgement of the long road ahead, and the fragile, beautiful beginning they were finally ready to embrace. The sunlight, now fully illuminating the room, seemed to bathe them in a warmth that extended beyond the physical, a gentle promise of the healing to come. The sprawling Thorne estate hummed with a quiet energy. Sunlight slanted through the leaded glass windows of the conservatory, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden shafts. Anya, perched on a wicker chair, hummed a soft melody, her fingers tracing the delicate veins of a philodendron leaf. The scent of blooming jasmine mingled with the earthy fragrance of the potting soil.